What a great move. Okay, Jack, are we going live? Okay. If everyone could take their seats, we are about ready to start.
The Zap folder
And you're gonna have to put your papers away.
and the PDF.
So until after.
If you could just drag the PDF to the desktop.
Jack will let me know when we're on. So, what a gorgeous weekend. We all think it's really summer and what are we doing?
Recording in progress.
Oh, Mr. Harriman. All set? Okay. Here we are. Welcome everyone to a regularly scheduled meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. It is Monday, May 8th. And I'm Deb Crossley, Chair of the Committee at Large from Ward 5. I'm joined at the beginning of the meeting by Councilor Vicki Danberg, Vice Chair of the Committee at Large from Ward 6. Councilor Pam Wright at the other end of the table at Large from Ward 3. And President Susan Albright, Councilor at Large from Ward 2. And Allison Leary, Councilor at Large from Ward 1, and Holly Ryan, Ward Councilor.
I'm hearing it.
And we
Yeah.
are just now by Councilor Lyle Baker, Ward Councilor from Ward 7. Online. Here? Yeah, okay. Online, we have Councilor Josh Krinsman at Large from Ward 4. Let's see. We have a number of other counselors joining us this evening. I see Councilors Andrea Kelly, Andrea Downs.
How are you sure I don't have sound on?
What's it? Alicia Bowman. Was that her? Yeah. Okay. I'm not seeing anyone else quite yet. Oh, I do. I see Councilor Rick Lipoff in the upper left-hand corner, 2 down and 2 over. I know this is, it's always a challenge. So we are joined as well by members of the planning board. I see Mr. Kelly Brown, Chair of the Planning Board. Would you like to introduce your members who are here? And you're muted. What would a meeting be without you?
Yeah, absolutely. I see Peter Doringer, and I'm not sure who else, to be honest with you. Amy Dane. Yeah, that's all I've
Okay.
got for the moment. There may be others. So
Hey, Kelly, I'm here as a city hall icon. I'm off camera.
I always forget, Barney. You're part of the team. Yes, that's right.
Barney Heath is here also on Zoom. And at the table, we are joined by Zachary Lamel and Jen Kyra from the planning department, who've been staffing our project all the way through. And we are joined by members of UTEAL, who I'm Tim Love, and help me out again.
Lauren Report.
Sorry.
Lauren Report.
Lauren Report. Okay, I'm gonna get that one of these days. And it's just, the time in between, a month in between, and I'm lost. So we have 2 items on our agenda, which is one discussion. Tonight is all zoning all the time. Item 3822 is the discussion and review relative to the draft zoning ordinance on village centers. And item 3922 is discussion on state guidance for implementing the housing choice bill. And we're from now on going to take these up simultaneously for the record, because we will from now on be talking about how well our VCOD zoning is meeting the MBTA compliance requirements, MBTA communities compliance requirements. For the public who's with us, we all got in our packets, which are online, fairly extensive material. This week, we got 2 versions of the entire draft text behind the zoning and planning staff memo, which tells us that it's a long way toward completion. However, it's still a draft, and you'll be hearing again this evening that we're still working on the metrics for some things, particularly what is called the MRT district. We'll be talking more about that tonight. Just before we start, we won't have much time at our next meeting this month, if really any time, to talk about zoning, because it's our budget meeting. We might, we're likely to have a memo. We are going to have a memo to update us on where the team gets on some of the metrics they're still fooling with, and we're going to try and meet early that night to talk if we want to just review the memo and so forth. Otherwise, we're going to June because May is budget month. So with that, and yes, Councilor Baker, do you have a procedural question?
No, I have a calendar question. Do we have a chance to talk about calendar at some point?
Yes, we will be talking about calendar, and as the memo outlines next step, but we're gonna put it on a timeline. Because I'll say at the beginning, we can say it at the end too, we really do want to open the public hearing on the draft, which still needs some work between now and then, at the end of June. We'll leave the hearing open, of course, as the team continues to work over the summer. And go back in September. That's the idea.
Okay.
So that we open before the summer, hear from folks, especially, there's a lot of folks following us for a very long time. And then leave it open until the fall and continue it in the fall. So there's a presentation this evening, and like we did last time, it was very successful for most everyone to let the presentation go forward in full. No interruptions. The questions for clarification kind of got off, made other people sort of confused. So we're going to go through the presentation. We're spending the whole meeting on this, so we can go back as we wish in the presentation, and there'll be time just for questions. And this is what we'll be taking up on, I think it's June 8th is our first June, do I have that right? Our first June meeting, this 12th. Is it?
The 12th, yes.
Okay, Monday is the 12th. So our first meeting in June 12th, will be focused entirely on this as well. So with that, I don't know which one of you is beginning. Ms. Kyra.
Yes, I'm gonna kick things off. Okay, so we're here to continue our discussion about the Village Center rezoning. So if you remember last meeting, we had released the maps, and our focus was mostly on the changes to the maps and how that brings us into potential compliance with MBTA communities law. This week, we released the full draft zoning ordinance. So we're going to focus more on the actual changes from version 1 to version 2 in the text. Next slide. So we're going to quickly talk about how we got here, our timeline thus far, and what our approach is. And then we're going to go into the actual updates in the version 2 ordinance, and then talk about our next steps. So, you've seen this timeline many times at this point, but just as a reminder, we've been focused just on the village centers for the last 2 years. And it started with a lot of data analysis, qualitative research, what makes a good village center, an extensive engagement effort where we ask people to vision their ideal village center and what they want to see. We then looked at how those visions could translate into zoning and what those zoning priorities were in order to try and implement that vision. This led to analysis of our existing zoning and a framework for what the main proposal could be under the village center zoning in order to really achieve the vital village centers with diverse housing and all the things we're looking to achieve. additional engagement leading up to at the end of this past year, we released version 1.0 of the maps and the text. Since then, we've been collecting input with the community here at the committee with various groups and boards and commissions in order to identify those main changes between version 1 and 2. So that's what we've been focused on these last few months, is a framework for version 2.0 of the zoning. So last time we talked about maps, now we're here to talk about the full ordinance. And then our next step would be a public hearing. So again, just as a reminder, the goal here was creating vibrant village centers. Far and away, when we spoke with people, this is what people wanted to see. More opportunities for diverse housing, for living in walkable areas, support for small businesses, new businesses, creating gathering spaces, creating opportunities for more affordable and accessible housing. So the code is intended to, at its core, be fairly simple. We're regulating urban form through 3 primary mechanisms: through the footprint of the building, so that the building is never, the footprint is never larger than what we think is appropriate for that village center context, a maximum building height in stories and in feet, and regulating the roof form and given options for a step back flat roof or a pitched roof at the half story. Okay. And we currently have 4 districts proposed. So the initial version 1.0 had 3 districts, BC1 through BC3. We've added the multi-residence transit or MRT zone. So this is a sort of scaled down residential zone that's meant to fit in the residential neighborhoods and allow for a form that's not unlike existing single family homes, but allows for them to convert to multiple units or to build multiple units, where currently you can only do 1 or 2 units. The Village Center 1, it allows for a larger footprint, but still 2.5 stories, but introduces some commercial uses. And if you remember from our previous meeting, this is focused just along portions of Route 9. The Village Center 2 is kind of on the periphery of the core of some of the larger village centers and is, the primary zone in some of the smaller village centers. This allows 3.5 stories and a 10,000 square foot footprint and allows a mix of commercial and residential uses. And then the Village Center 3 allows for up to 4.5 stories and a 15,000 square foot footprint, and again, a mix of commercial and residential uses. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it off to Zach Lamel.
Hey, everybody. Good to be back in person. Sorry about the last meeting.
We're glad you're well.
Happy to be here, always well. So as Jen was saying, at its core, the code is fairly simple. But I want to dive into kind of key elements of the zoning and some key updates that we made between version 1.0 and version 2.0, and then also talk about some of the ongoing work, as the chair mentioned, relating to the MRT metrics and kind of where we're going. So when it comes to the proposal, it is an overlay district. The Village Center Overlay District, I'll probably use VCOD for short. There's a lot of advantages and benefits to thinking about an overlay district. When it comes to choice and opportunity, property owners are only gaining rights when it comes to an overlay district. There's nothing being taken away from property owners if the overlay district is applied to their property. We also are able to tailor each solution to the village centers. We know not all village centers are the same, and we know that our current zoning doesn't treat them any differently. You can see in this map here, which shows the base zoning in solid colors and the proposed VCOD in kind of bolded outlines. You see in the core of Newton Center is red, which is our business zones. Those same business zones are used in Newton Corner, West Newton, Nonantum, doesn't matter. And then you can also see on the far right side of this map, there is a lot in red to the south of the green line that is also a business zone. If we were to change the base underlying zoning and allow additional development, like we may want to see in Newton Center, then that property that's on the right side there that's being somewhat cut off would also have that same development allowance, and we may not want to do that. So the overlay district allows us to focus in on where we want to see development, we want to see change over time, and make sure it happens there and not in places that we don't want to. Also, we're talking about our village centers. There's really kind of strong design standards that are built in to allow and support village center development, and we can incorporate those really nicely into an overlay district. And then finally, particularly on the periphery here, we think this will create an opportunity for change over time. We're really talking about the MRT zones, where these are, periphery areas going from the village centers to the residential neighborhoods, where we do have a mixture of single family, two family, small multifamily homes. The MRT allowance is one that we think will create new development, as well as the opportunity for preservation and adaptive reuse of the buildings that are there now. Next slide. As we've been saying throughout this process, the VCOD districts all allow for and really support by right development. However, that doesn't mean that the special permit process is totally going away. There are a series of approval processes that are baked in. Some of those are special permit. We've talked about this a lot as it relates to the size of the lot. At a certain size, over 30,000 square feet, a special permit is triggered. In other instances, site plan review would be triggered. Not going to get into detail in any of these, but I just wanted to be clear that the special permit process is not going away. It is just being tailored to, where we know additional discretion or review is required. Next slide. When it comes to the building height, as Jen was saying, there's an overall number of stories and an overall maximum height that is put in place for the 4 zones. This is really a flexible system to allow for the types of uses on the ground floor that we want to see that need taller floor-to-floor heights. It also allows for, higher floor-to-floor heights in office development if that were to be the case. But again, the cap of number of stories in each zone will limit the overall development. You can't build a 75-foot tall building in VC3 and put in 7 stories. You can only do 4.5 stories. So this is really about creating flexibility, creating an opportunity for varied roof heights, varied building heights, which I know is an important thing that's been discussed at this committee a bunch. Next slide. In addition to the overall height, as Jen was saying, there's a maximum building footprint. This is really to encourage smaller sites to develop. We don't want to see the aggregation of numerous sites at once and a whole block being torn down. And if we do, obviously, then the special permit process would be triggered and there'd be that additional level of review that would go to the city council. But we really think that the building footprint, which you see here, as well as the heights, which we just looked at, are really going to be a great opportunity for creating kind of infill developments at varying roof forms and varying sizes. And when you do start to get bigger, the building, you can't build more than one. You have to break up the building, essentially. You can't go beyond this footprint. Next slide. I'm not going to get into all the numbers here, but what I want to make sure is very clear is that when a VCOD zone abuts a residential district, there are additional requirements, additional kind of safeguards that come into play. Those are increased setbacks when you abut a residential district. It also includes step down in height. So within 50 feet of a residential district lot line, you have to drop you lose a story in VC3. And also there are screening requirements as well along those boundaries that abut a residential district. Next slide. Another piece that we've talked about a bunch, but I really just want to highlight is there are certain areas within each village center that are designated as mixed use priority streets. Ground floor active uses are required. When we talk about vibrant village centers, when we talk about pedestrian activity, we're talking about places and spaces that are bringing people into the village centers. And so we wanted to make sure in each one of the VCOD village centers that there were key areas where this would be required. And then the areas in VC2 and VC3 that are not showing that black line, it is optional. It could be in all residential building, it could be in all commercial building, it could be a mixed use building. So you do have that flexibility there, but again, the core requires ground floor uses. Next slide. Hand it off to you for this
Sure.
one. That'd be
So
great.
the next two slides are going to speak to ways in which the zoning code is modulating how we articulate facades. So these numbers probably look familiar to you in that they were in our previous version of the draft ordinance. But essentially, we're proposing a minimum facade build out ratio of 75%. We think this is something that's going to encourage positive urban design that will relate better to the street and just generally create a more activated public realm. Likewise, we also are regulating the maximum length of a continuous facade. We think this is a measure that's going to be really important in breaking down the scale of larger buildings. It's going to be something that after 100 feet of continuous length, you then have the option of either having a recess or an offset, and it's something that we're defining as a minimum of 7 by 10 feet. And this is something that's going to break down that scale and make the building appear as almost as if it's multiple buildings rather than one larger mass. Next slide. So going into that a little bit further, there are other ways that we can build character into the architecture and begin to diversify facades. So architectural features such as bays, balconies, and canopies are all ways that we can break up a facade even further. And the great thing about these is they don't actually count towards your building area. We have dimensional standards embedded within the code that define how far these are allowed to encroach upon a setback and just how wide and how deep they can be. But we think they're really great and provide opportunities for diversifying building form. And we're showing options. You might remember these illustrations from when we were looking at VC3 perspectives. So we're just highlighting here for you ways in which those architectural features were deployed in their use. So we're showing different versions of balconies, some bay windows, and canopies to denote entrances to buildings.
So, and just to kind of follow up there, all of these things we feel like can be used together to create, again, a variety of architectural forms and diversity and kind of a mosaic of buildings that we would want to and would expect to see within our village centers. In addition, this is something we've spoken about, the opportunity for greater and deeper levels of affordability. There's two options that are within the draft zoning. Option one would be allowed in the VC2 and VC3 districts. An additional story would be allowed plus 2,500 square feet in footprint. And the affordable percentage of units would go from 17.5% to 25%. In VC3 only would be option two, where you could do an additional 2 stories, the same plus 2,500 square foot bonus, and then you would have to provide 30% of the units to be affordable. And when it comes to rental or ownership, there's 2 different breakdowns in affordability. It's either for rental, the units need to average out to 65% AMI, and all of those units need to be within a range of 50 to 80% AMI. And for ownership, all the units would need to be no greater than 80% AMI. So this is greater, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna talk about where BC3 option 2 can happen, but.
That's true, yeah. Well, I'll just say that again, so this is an increase in the number of affordable units that will be required and deeper levels of affordability than are currently required in our inclusionary zoning ordinance. Touch upon.
So right now, we're saying for option 2, it can only be in VC3 when VC3 is not abutting MRT or residential district. So it does limit the areas where this can be used in VC3. We are still doing some more analysis on this to see if this is the right measure or if we need to be a bit more prescriptive or tackle this in a slightly different way. So that was the initial proposal, but we are still working through that.
Right. Next slide. Another piece that is in the code, and Councilor Baker, you brought this up at the last meeting. There are measurements and kind of requirements for when parking is provided. That it doesn't negatively impact the streetscape, that it is pushed away and, maybe safely located. So within the draft zoning ordinance, there are parking setbacks along, whether it's a right of way or, just a lot line. There are maximum requirements for the entryways to parking, like we have spoken about in the garage ordinance, probably a year and a half ago now at this point. No parking can be between the front lot line and the front facade of the building. So, when it comes to village center buildings, it's very typical that the building is pushed up. Another way that we're going to make sure to do that is you can't put parking between the building and the street. It has to go behind. Curb cuts are limited to one curb cut per street frontage. And in addition, when available, if you were on a corner lot, let's say, where you had two access points to your lot, there's clearly going to be a front of your building and a side of your building, or if you have a through lot where there's a front of your building and a back of your building, what's designated as the front cannot be where your parking goes in. You have to go from the side or the back. And then finally, like there's screening requirements when you go by a residential district, there are screening requirements for the parking. Next slide. In this version 2.0, parking is of course allowed, it is not required. We believe that in addition to making sure that when parking is provided, it's properly placed, this allowance, but not requirement, would really kind of play into all the things we've been talking about, strong streetscape and pedestrian experience, a better environmental outcome, a reduction in traffic congestion, right? If we build new development that doesn't have parking and people live there and they don't have cars, those are cars that are not driving on our streets and adding to the congestion. We talked about the parking standards, about location. We do require bike parking. Councilor Laredo brought up a really good point, making sure that when bike parking is required and when it maybe shouldn't be. So for smaller projects, bike parking would not be required. For larger projects, they would be, and that is all detailed out in the draft ordinance, and making sure, for proper safety, location, when that bike parking is provided. Next slide, and I will turn this over to you guys.
So I want to preface the next few slides about the multi-residence transit district by saying this is something that we know is newer. We are currently studying it. So the numbers that we're presenting tonight are kind of a second pass, but we're certainly open to your input, and we are continuing to study and refine this as we go. This MRT district is really something that's meant to act as a buffer between the activity of the village center zones and the surrounding residential neighborhoods. And we're exploring two different pathways within this district. First and foremost, though, we're really looking to preserve existing homes. That's something that's really important. And we're trying to find ways to incentivize conversion of those existing homes to multifamily construction. There's also a new construction pathway in this district, which would be to allow for smaller scale multifamily buildings that relate better to their residential context. So
it's just worth pointing out with those two examples, keep in mind the building footprint of these two examples. One is under 1,500 square feet and one is about 200 square feet over. But these are generally the size of existing buildings we think that would lend themselves well, if they're currently single family or two families, to including 4, 5, or 6 units. We're going to be getting into some of these metrics, which is why I wanted to call this out.
Excuse me just a second.
Folks, I'm just getting cold from the breeze here. You all right?
Shut the window, thank you. Just to be my guest.
Does this footprint include the porches and that, or is that just the house?
That's a very good question. Does it include the porches?
These wouldn't, I'm pretty sure. I mean, these are estimates, they're from the assessor's database. But the porches, don't believe are included here.
Yeah. And we wouldn't, they're not counted in our proposed zoning as part of the footprint either, to encourage those being included as part of the architecture, like the bays.
Okay, can we go forward? I'm sorry for. Yeah, go ahead.
Next, Lauren.
All right, so now we're going to dive into the dimensional standards for both the new construction and multifamily conversion option. So the new construction for MRT is very similar to the VC1 district. The main difference really is in the size of the building footprint. So we're looking at 1,500 square feet, and this would allow for a maximum number of units that's 4, versus the multifamily conversion. These numbers all apply to the new addition that would be added. So we're looking at setbacks that ensure it to be far enough from the front lot line so that it's contextual, as well as the new height that would be added is also at the same height that we're proposing for VC1 and the new construction. Some things that might look newer to you are, before we were considering an addition of 400 square feet, which admittedly we thought might be too limiting. So we're now exploring an option to allow the addition to exceed the original footprint by 50%. We're also increasing the maximum number of units to 6, and we're hoping that that's going to provide a nice incentive relative to the new construction option. And lastly, we're allowing for multiple buildings per lot to be included with site plan review.
Just real quick here, for the multifamily conversion, when we say the existing footprint can be exceeded by up to 50%. If your existing footprint is over 1,500, so if you have a 2,500 square foot building footprint, it's 50% of that. So I think when you can be within the setbacks, when you have the space, we really want you to be able to create a viable project. And you'll get into more detail here.
One other piece of this might not be clear in this table. You can only do those additions if you're 20 feet off the front facade or in the rear. You can't, they can't be carbuncles that are in the front or near the front facade. And so I think that one of our next steps that you might ask us to do, but I'm going to preempt you asking us, is that we would do a couple of design studies to show you what this might look like versus new construction. Take a couple of examples and play these rules out.
Can I just ask a question?
We are.
All right,
Let's-
yeah,
no,
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 okay.
sorry, I love you, Vicky. All right.
Yeah.
House to the right. Okay.
Next slide. So we are aware that there are challenges to converting existing homes. So putting our architect hats on, some renovations that we would anticipate in this process are that building code would require upgrades for access and egress to each unit. So that would entail, considering hallways and making sure that each unit has access to a stairway. And one thing to make clear is Massachusetts building code only stipulates that you have one egress stair for buildings that have less than 12 units. So it doesn't necessarily require the building of a new stairway, but to make sure that all the units have access to one means of egress. It would also mean that there would need to be new plumbing chases for the kitchens and bathrooms for each unit. Soundproofing to be added.
What a chase is, I'm sorry. That's
Oh.
one question.
Absolutely. So a plumbing chase is what you would have to bring the plumbing services between each unit. So typically you have what's called a wet wall, and that wall is going to have all of your plumbing, your pipes, everything that's bringing the water and services through.
Okay,
Mhm.
thank you.
It's typically a 1 foot space, 1 foot wall, more or less. You'd also be adding soundproofing between the units and separate utility metering for each unit. But we are hoping that we can still incentivize the conversion by allowing for a larger footprint than before. So again, up to 50% of the existing footprint, and this is something we are studying. Allowing more units in the conversion process than in the new construction process. So this would be up to 6 units as opposed to 4 units maximum in the new construction. And to allow multiple buildings by site plan review, which hopefully removes any kind of barriers to that conversion process.
just a market perspective on what we're trying to do here, which is to incentivize, we hope the code reduces the risk of tear downs and incentivizes conversions, to convert 1 and 2 families to 3 units to 6. And so we designed the code, we think, to do that in conceptual collaboration with John Tanzi from Landwise. But these are some other things to consider in addition to the cost of conversions, which is that one advantage we think of the code for conversion is that it will incentivize smaller units to take these very large houses with 2-family buildings and make them multifamily units that are smaller. And that, as we've discussed in several meetings, will create more affordable units, not because of the cost per square foot, but just because they're smaller and will create more housing options for people new to the market or empty nesters. It is true that existing homes have a high embedded value in new. And so one of the questions is when a single family home in our proposed MRT overlay zone is on the market, would the highest and best use be a single family home still, or exploring one of these conversions is something we have to look at with John? Allowing that extra square footage only if you pursue the multifamily option, but not allowing it for single family might be a path that incentivizes that happening. 50% footprint metric that we're proposing this evening. The condition of the existing structure will have an impact on viability. If an existing home or a 2-family is a real fixer upper, John's sense, I support that, is that the chances might be higher that a developer would consider it for a multifamily conversion versus a home that's in much better shape, where the market can just absorb it the way it does. Larger lots that allow for the maximum footprint or even a second structure are going to be more attractive, obviously, for multifamily up to 6 units. And then, as we said before, we're proposing additional analysis working with Landwise, both on the financial pro forma side, but also by looking at some of the design implications of these new design standards that we're proposing this evening.
And on that one, we're looking at new construction as well as the conversion. So our update here was increasing the footprint for the conversion, because we really do want to make that a viable, attractive option. But we want to make sure that the new construction also can be a viable option, and how it compares to the underlying zoning, and what happens when you get to a certain lot size and you can subdivide and do 2 of these small multifamily buildings. So we're having Landwise look at a number of these scenarios right now to help guide us if we need to make some tweaks to the MLT zone.
So those were really the kind of key updates between version 1.0 and version 2.0. I know we shared a 100-page memo, so a lot of information to go through, but wanted to briefly look at the calendar and talk about next steps. Hoping that the committee can set a public hearing for the end of June, as we continue to kind of refine and bring in your input, but we really want to make sure that we have enough time to notice everyone and make sure that we get the message out. We also know we're working on somewhat of a committee of the whole meeting in advance of that public hearing. We know we are typically joined by a large portion of the city council, but we want to make sure that everyone at the city council is fully informed and up to date. That would allow us to hold the public hearing, like we said, at the end of June. As the chair mentioned, then we can go into the summer, dotting our I's, crossing our T's, making sure that this zoning, this VCOD ordinance is ready to be inserted into our zoning code. getting us into the fall for a committee vote and hopefully a council vote. With that, I will turn it back over
Yeah,
to
you
you.
always were very ambitious and we appreciate all of your hard work. So just to, in terms of the timeline, we had discussed getting a memo for our next meeting or in advance of our next meeting, just to update the committee on where the team is, you and you, Teal, for our next meeting. I don't know, we'll talk separately to see if we can squirrel away some time, like a half an hour, just to touch base on zoning at that meeting, at our budget meeting. But then by June 12th, we'll have the feedback consolidated from the analysis, the design analysis on the one hand, because it seems to me that you're looking at where is this kind of development you're proposing, either the adaptive reuse or the new building, where can it physically happen? And we have this wide range of lot sizes, and so on some of the lots, simply isn't going to be possible. Maybe on quite a few of them, simply isn't going to be possible to do either of these things. The underlying zoning will just rule. And then the other is, which is really a separate question, but it's related, where is it financially feasible? Where's there a financial incentive to do the adaptive reuse? For example, I actually don't see any hands up, but there we go. Okay, everybody wants to talk, and I would like to hear from everyone in the committee, but hold on. I don't want to lose my train of thought. I would like to, I would suggest, and just nod your head if you think it's a good idea. The new zone, the MRT zone, it requires a lot of discussion. Can we focus on that first? And should we take it in two pieces? There's the adaptive reuse metrics. And then there's the new building metrics. The adaptive reuse, there's a proposal in front of us, but for the new building, we're going to see something new after the analysis is done. But we can talk about, what particular aspects of that are. What are the levers that we might want to pull? What do you think? Can we do it that way? Okay. Then I'm going to just start here and, okay, go around. Counselor Danberg.
Thank you. On the MRT slide, it's has a 20-foot front setback for new construction.
For the reuse.
Yes, for the addition. This would be, yes, that one.
That's all facade.
Under multifamily conversion. Does that mean that front setback 20 feet for new addition? Does that mean that if you want to add on to the rear of the building, you have to have a 20-foot front setback in the front?
No,
Then what does that mean?
I think we need to qualify, that means a little bit more, it's setback from the front facade, is it different than a front?
of the house.
It's from the front of the house.
Setback. The addition has to be set back from the front of the house.
Right, along the side facade.
Okay.
So if it's at the rear, it's fine.
Okay, I was confused by that and thought that meant,
Yeah. Yeah.
that the house needed a 20-foot setback because that would make it tough.
Yeah.
A lot of
Right.
old buildings just wouldn't have.
Or labeling.
It should be set back from the front facade.
Okay, and if you have a large lot, let's say 25,000 square feet, 22,000 square feet. And you have a small footprint, let's say you have a 1,500 square foot, the 1,500 square foot footprint on a small two-family, so that it's 2 units. Are you only allowed to increase the size of that building by 50% or?
The footprint, so if the footprint is 1,500 square feet, you could add 750 square foot of additional footprint, not total square footage. And that 750 square feet that you add has to be at least 20 feet from the front facade, has to meet the setbacks. And so it might be partly on the side and wrap around the back. But you can go the 2 full 1.5 stories with that.
The lot that I'm thinking of is 145 Warren Street,
Okay,
which is a long, narrow lot that goes all the way down to the track, the T tracks.
okay,
And onto this 1,500 square foot small two-family, 4 units were added in rear.
okay.
That could not be done
So
under.
you could through site plan review.
Okay.
So we're allowing multiple buildings on the lot through site plan review. So in that case, if you had a wider lot, you'd probably subdivide it
Yeah.
into multiple lots.
Yeah.
For a deep lot like that, you could do
The second
a
structure,
second building.
Yeah.
Through site plan review.
Okay,
as long as they were 15 feet apart. Did I get that right?
And- Correct. And do the 750 square foot footprint addition to the existing
yeah,
building.
okay,
So you
okay,
could increase
You
the
could do
existing
two-per.
building and add an additional structure to potentially get the same or more units than 145 Warren.
okay.
But to be clear, that particular example could not be built by right because there's much more
Yeah.
footprint
It,
than.
it couldn't be built by right
As-
as it
Actually,
is.
what is
It
proposed.
wasn't, it was,
Yeah,
but
it was
we all
not
know, it was a
special
special
permit,
permit,
yeah.
it would still be a special permit.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
I just want to make sure that's clear in case, I don't know who's watching, it might be confusing.
move brings it into the special?
It would be site plan review.
The footprint's too big.
So it'd
be Of the site plan addition.
review or special permit?
It would be site plan review. We're not allowing additional footprint by special permit. So what they could do, they couldn't build that specific project most likely. What they could do was convert the existing home to multiple units and add on to the rear of it, the 750 square feet. They could do a second building that's 1,500 square feet
With 4 units.
with 4 units. Or up to 4 units through site plan review.
But that particular project
Could not.
Could not.
could not be done,
No.
they'd have to go back to the underlying zoning and get a special permit against it.
Correct.
Could be. the
Okay,
other
I
option.
just wanted to make sure
Yes.
that's crystal clear, so
Yeah.
that nobody leaves thinking that project could be done by right or site plan review.
Which project could be done?
145 Warren
The
Street
one that exists now?
Yeah.
Okay.
could
I
not
got it.
be done
Yeah.
by right or by site plan review.
I have a question on that one. So what's stopping you from dividing that lot into 3 lots? And so you have the original house 50% and then 2 buildings of 1,500.
Yeah, so for some large lots, that may be the best option. Is you subdivide a large lot and you can do multiple small buildings. For that particular one, because it's so deep,
It doesn't have frontage.
it doesn't have the frontage, so we did write into the second version, something about rear lots. So we pulled in a slightly modified definition of rear lots from elsewhere in the code. And said they're not allowed in BC2, BC3, but you could do them by special permit in MRT and BC1. So that one potentially could come and subdivide into one additional lot through a special permit as a rear lot subdivision.
What's limiting it to just one, why not multiple?
Doesn't have the street frontage, the second
Because
lot.
the way the rear lot is set up, you can only do one rear lot. You can't do,
I didn't see the numbers in there saying how much frontage you need and things like that. So I wonder if you had a shared driveway the whole way and just break it up into a bunch of lots going down.
yeah, that section probably still needs some refinement. So it's a new section. The intent is that only in the MRT and BC1 districts could you even ask for it.
Okay, so you
And
would
then
only
it
get
would
one rear
follow
lot.
kind of our existing structure and you could do one rear lot, but only by special permit.
And then the other question is, in the documentation where you see you can do multiple buildings, there's an S on there, so you could do on that lot, 145, you could possibly do 4 additional buildings. You have the original house, add 50%, and then 4 buildings of 1,500 square feet, correct?
If they're 15 feet apart.
Yeah.
And if you meet all the setbacks and through site plan review, and those additional buildings get expensive. So it's much more efficient to do one building. We wouldn't expect to see a lot of separate buildings.
I see 2 though.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say we should go in order. I
Oh, yeah,
understand,
just wanted to
I understand we're
make sure.
talking about 145 Warren and, yeah, we want to make it clear what could be done on that site, which isn't as much, it sounds like, as what people are poking holes at it, which is good. So Counselor Danberg, are you all set?
I'm done.
Okay, Counselor Baker.
So I've got, Yes, three categories. First, I just want to say on the calendar, I think if you're gonna have a committee of the whole, I don't know if the president would be amenable to this, but have it on the night of the council meeting, because I think Thursday night is gonna be difficult.
We tried. But
Graduation from Newton South. At the same night as a council meeting. That night?
that was on
June sixth or.
June, yeah, the first council meeting.
It's kind of too late. It almost, it's,
Well,
Same.
the committee of the whole is later than that. In June. Okay,
The committee of the whole now is proposed for June 22nd.
yeah.
22nd.
which is after.
And the council meeting is the Monday prior.
Yeah, we were also want to make sure that we have our full team available. So I think we're
Right.
working around that.
Right, we were, because we had another date and the
Yeah.
full team is available on the 22nd.
That's Thursday, another people might as well, but that's just my concern. But second, I think that one night for public hearing on this is gonna be a real challenge, especially just for the vacation week. And I just mentioned that.
There won't be one night, we're gonna begin the public hearing, leave it open all summer and bring people, well, let me say it this way. We don't normally can have public hearings in the summer. People complain that it's the summer. So I actually think it's a little bit silly because if everybody's around in June. Some people will still be around in July. We could continue to hear from people if we so chose a night in July. But,
And
I'll go with the will of,
I'd be
Everyone.
cautious about that. I think we
Yeah.
need to be, you want the maximum public. But I do think some people have expressed concern even about that in late June. That's why I'm interested in the city council.
just want to open it so that we can get started and get some feedback. We'll have a committee of the whole and that so that we can, we'll have to see how it goes. And we
Okay,
see if we get to the point where.
I realize the scheduling and all of that, but I do think the council members need to be there in addition to the team. So that's part of my concern about the one we've got. Committee of the whole.
Well, let's finish the
Yeah.
calendar though.
Yeah.
If you,
You'll
so
sort that out.
we looked at the 14th and the team's not available on the 14th. Yeah, okay. So the only other date is, what's the council meeting? 19th, was the council meeting the 19th?
That's what I was hoping. we should do.
the 20th.
It's the 20th, okay, Monday, the 20th. Are you busy on Monday, the 20th?
19th.
It's Tuesday the 20th, we're closed.
Oh, Tuesday. Oh, right.
Tuesday, the
Tuesday,
20th.
20th.
Is the team you four or is?
Why are you close to Monday the 19th? Oh,
Juneteenth.
June, yes.
20. 20's good.
Yeah.
We're gonna start early.
Is there a land use meeting? Does anybody know?
No, there's a full.
No,
council.
there's full council.
Okay, got it.
We seem to all be available. On the 20th.
2 days earlier, I bet, which is fine. Let's say that's a very likely possibility,
Well, may not again, but I just know
It's an option.
people aren't here.
right?
So that's process concern. Second, but thank you for responding. Second, I just, when you're talking about the MRTs, which we're talking about first, there's a inherent calculation built into the MRTs that we talked about how many units it generates. But the multifamily conversion runs the number up potentially significantly if it's taken advantage of. Now, if it's not taken advantage of, it's not, so I just don't know how that calculus works, but I do think needs to be, because my question last time was, we're taking the MRT and trying to satisfy that, plus the village centers, and you've got really more than the MBT communities is asking us to add when you put the two programs together, and that's a very significant change in the city. I think we need to really think through as a macro issue, but I'd like to understand sort of what we're talking about, the dimensions of in terms of numbers.
I think if it's okay to address that for a minute, I think we're hoping to. The advantage of the new build is, while this is not. The number one goal of this effort is to meet the MBTA communities housing choice goal. But the question is with the conversion, how big would the existing footprint and square footage of the building need to be for that choice to be exercised, and how many units reasonably would you get? So while that overlay would be allowed for conversion, you know, can we do a rough analysis to know how many existing buildings would actually even pursue that path?
Well, I guess part of the question is, does it count for the MBTA communities?
You don't get any credit.
We count the 4 units, because for MBTA communities, you have to assume there's a blank slate.
Yeah.
And it's what you could build. So because this is dependent upon taking an existing building, and converting it, that doesn't count. So we count the 4 unit new construction towards MBTA.
Okay. And then the somewhat related issue, which goes to the parking question, both for the commercial as well. Do these have any parking requirements?
Not as currently proposed. There are no parking's allowed, but it's not, you're not setting a specific. Correct.
Correct.
And then just one other thing on the parking for the commercial factory, when you were talking, Mr. O'Malley, you were talking about it being behind. One of the questions obviously is, how does that work? The only example I know of that is recently built is Trio, but you have a lot behind it to use for that purpose and access, which obviously in some situations, like in Brattleboro, I don't recall the parking up there when I've been up there being behind the buildings. They were in a separate lot down the street. So I think part of the that I'm curious about is sort of how these parking issues play out when they build on the ground. And the other issue is simply dimensional. If you have 2 VC3s opposite each other and a narrow streetscape, that's a very different feel. I remember what you were talking about, sort of the relative ratio of height to street. And there might be situations where a setback to allow parking might be in the public interest. And I don't know exactly what that would be, but I just think that there's, I'm a little nervous about having an automatic rule of that kind. Now, maybe there are ways to do and say, this is a good place to do this, to provide some breathing room really for the front. And I don't know the answer to that, but I just, seems to me that's a piece of the public that might bear some examination. And then the last thing is that, to pick up on the point, I really think we need to have some examples. Again, not just of the existing buildings and saying this is similar to that, you know, which you've done. You've sort of picked up existing structures in the city and said this is sort of what we have in mind. But literally, what would mean on the ground? What would it look like? How does it play out? So, because it's very hard to make these judgments in the abstract.
Well, I wonder if, speaking of the MRT and the kind of tests that we're gonna do, if the development that Councilor Albert, you mentioned, what was the address again?
145 Warren.
I wonder if we run that test, because there's the addition, we could pretend like the addition wasn't done, and then we could try our MRT 2 options on the same lot. People can see what was built. Maybe that would be one. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but I'm imagining.
It would be helpful.
Yeah.
It's in the district.
Yeah.
You did something one more time, we didn't write it.
145 Warren Street.
Okay.
Send you everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
The parking, typically your parking, you don't have to have an empty surface lot behind you. It could be within the building. It could be underground.
Right.
We want to make sure if it's within the building, though, that it's not right up against the street, that it's lined by residential units or commercial uses.
Or lobby.
Or lobby. But it doesn't mean that there are these empty surface parking lots behind each building. A lot of times the parking is contained within the building footprint itself. And for parcels, you can have a driveway entrance from the street. So if you have, you could access the parking from the street if you don't have a secondary frontage. We also hope to have more of the Brattleboro example. We'd love to see parking gets combined in places and consolidated. But that requires the flexibility in our code. So currently the way our code is written, it's very difficult to do that. and you need special permits. If we remove the parking requirements, but still allow for the parking and allow for that flexibility, you can do that. You can have private landowners work together and share parking areas. You can also, you know, for the commercial usage, the public parking is really where we should be focusing people. You should have consolidated public parking lots. And which we do have. Now, we may need to think about the management of those and making sure that they're really meeting the needs. You know, we do hear in places like West Newton that the parking is constrained. But we're looking to have parking more sort of efficiently located and managed and not have every building serve only its parking needs. And that you're driving to every single place you go in parking again each time. So I think we could see some of those examples through this by removing some of those zoning restrictions that we have and allowing for more flexibility.
So that's VC2 and VC3 primarily that you're talking, maybe VC1, but not at the MRT.
We haven't written separate parking requirements for MRT.
Okay, sorry, you're not done.
Yeah, I just want to finish that up. I think that, I still have some concerns about how the parking is going to work and where the cars are going to go. I know there are those who feel that the cars will not come, and therefore that will solve the problem. I wish I had that degree of confidence. And if they come, they're going to come and park in some of the neighborhoods, and then we're going to hear more problems about that. So I do think that the decision not to include parking is one that we need to continue to reflect on, because we've got, as I hear it, more capacity in the sense of building out than we required to by this model.
Were we able to get a number? If we require one space per unit, how many fewer units are we enabling according to the formula?
We can come back to that. If we had, we would have put it in the packet. I think that's something for a later meeting.
And I think it's not just one, there's a sensitivity analysis. I think
Yeah,
that you're
we're
really
looking at
trying to say, you know, what if you did it in half? I mean,
Right.
rather than all or nothing, I think the question we're trying to figure out, is there a way to accommodate the reasonable demand that's going to be there to make sure it doesn't spill over? That also doesn't create.
And just to be clear, the draft zoning allows for developments to meet the reasonable demand. It's just the market and the development determining that, not the city. So the code doesn't prevent parking from being provided.
No, I understand that.
But I just want to make sure that that's clear when you talk about reasonable demand. We expect a developer and a development to meet that reasonable demand as they see is needed.
Right, but I'm thinking again, even if they're 6-unit conversion, if the folks, you hope they will all walk and not drive, but we've seen situations where people in multiple units have multiple cars.
You see that in single family homes now, where people have more cars than they can park
No, I understand.
on their lot. So we have
Councilor
tools.
Danberg talks about it regularly.
Yeah, we have tools to address those things if they do become an issue. We can look at permits and parking districts. But what we're trying to do is to not overpark, because what we've seen is the market has evolved faster than our zoning. So the trend has gone down in parking utilization. We're seeing, and still every new building we see is asking to build less parking, and then that parking is still ending up empty. So we'd rather let the market determine what is the reasonable demand. And then if we do have, if there are spillover impacts and it does create an issue, we have the tools to address that. In that
That's what I want to know what
location.
the tools are, because we had a whole conversation separately about the parking ban in the city and things like that.
Yeah, me too.
Because
Parking permits, and we've already been writing into,
Okay,
at the request of DPW, many of our special permits recently have already included conditions. That those new multifamily buildings, if a permit district is established in that area, the residents would not be eligible for on-street parking permits. And that's meant to prevent that spillover. If the spillover becomes an issue, that area can become a permit district. And you can permit on-street parking or, on-street parking over a certain number of hours. And written into many special permits, I know DPW has talked about making this an ordinance, is restricting those multifamily buildings from getting those on-street permits. So that you really are limited, you're only moving there if the parking on site works for you. Or if you make other arrangements.
Your special permits are gonna go away.
Right, but I said DPW is looking at making that, they've talked about making that an ordinance,
So
so.
basically the Cambridge model, isn't it? I mean, Cambridge is very restricted parking is, I think, residential.
Right.
So, I mean,
In
we're
Boston,
looking at a
it is
different
too.
sort of framework for Newton, if that's the case.
And it's not, and it may not ever be needed, so it may not be an issue, but those sorts of tools allow you to address those issues in a more targeted way if they become an issue. Rather than applying a blanket requirement across all new development that may not be the.
I guess
Calibrated.
I would just say, I'm open to persuasion, but my concern is to go from a 1 point per unit down to 0. There may be an argument that the demand in the private sector is less than the public sector has asked. That's what I'm hearing. That's sort of they're
That's what
chasing,
we've seen.
but it doesn't seem to me it's gone down to 0.
No, and we probably won't see 0, or at least very often, because you still need 5 and 6.
Yeah,
I
so
understand, but it's a question of
But
what our
it's-
public
it's-
policy
yeah.
is too.
is this what we call beating a dead horse?
No, it's not being that. This is a fundamental question, Madam Chair.
No, I
I
understand.
really resent that. I think it's the question of
Oh,
what we do
sorry, I
here.
heard a lot of repetition right there, but
Well,
never mind.
excuse me. I think it's a public policy that we're repeating. We're trying to understand what the implications
I
are.
understand.
All right,
So
and I really do resent the fact
I
that you're trying to cut me
apologize.
off.
Oh, I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you
All
off.
right, let me just finish up. I think the point I'm trying to get at is whether we should have some requirements, not just go to 0 because of the concerns that these tools may not be fit for all circumstances. That's part of my concern. Okay, now I'm done.
Point of information.
Well, just a sec. So just following on that, though, I wanted to ask if we'll have those numbers that I think
Yes.
everybody wants, not by the June, but by the memo, by the 2 weeks, maybe? It's something that, there's a bunch of numbers that we've been asking
Yes.
for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We started running an analysis, sensitivity analysis, it was a little bit more complicated than we thought it was gonna be, so it wasn't ready for prime time, but it will be in 2 weeks.
Okay, that's great. And following on that too, the other way we could look at this is not just to say, okay, what if we go from 1 to a half or 1 versus 1 to 0? But the MRT district is very different from the others, one could argue. And where I am ready to join my colleagues and say, let the market take care of this. Others may not be, and we have, does need to be a full conversation. I totally agree. But we
Right.
could look at MRT as a different animal from VC2 and VC3.
Right.
And that it's a neighborhood.
We have some units to spend from the 10,000 down to the 8,000, whatever, which is the threshold we have to hit. It says that we want
Right.
to spend that maybe on having some parking requirements, some percentage in some parts of the code before we run out of gas relative to our target number for the MBTA housing. It seems like spending it on some parking requirement might be good.
Persuasion.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, and just so everybody knows, I mean, this is as much a game that we're playing as it is real, because we know that development in a neighborhood is less saleable today without providing some parking on
Right.
site for the however many number of units you have, right? So we expect the parking will actually be built.
Yes.
And so we're not actually going to get any more housing as a result of not requiring the parking, because it will be built.
Yeah, and with the MRT, it's just a different building typology where you're probably looking at surface parking, right? It's not gonna be within the building typically. And given the footprint constraints, on many lots, you do have some space to provide those parking.
Okay, so just to say there's a couple of different, and we'll have those numbers so that we can kind of look at it and say,
We'll run the numbers, again, the sensitivity analysis. And then propose what this team thinks is the right balanced approach that still helps us meet MBTA communities, housing choice.
right.
So as
target.
part of it, will you tell us how many more units we need? Because clearly there's a balance between parking and units, right? That's what that formula does.
Right.
So will you, if
You
we have
know,
parking,
Tuesday-
you'll tell us how many more units we need.
By imposing some parking requirements. Our unit yield will go down,
Right,
but we don't want it to go down lower than the target we have to hit.
But-
right.
But you may have some of it go up because you've got the multifamily conversion, right?
No,
We
No.
don't count those.
no,
But you can't count that.
You can only count the 4 unit.
and I'll
Sorry.
complicate it a little bit more. You had 63% continuous, and you only need 50%. So that means you could add more land, and it does, and 10% can be more than a half a mile away. So you might take a high density area, neighborhood, maybe Newton Corner, I don't know. Add that as part of the whole thing, and that may help your numbers too. Now, the thing that you have to think about a little bit more is the priority streets, which those units, none of those units count at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
Okay, let's try and
there's other ways to play with it where you can get more numbers.
let's
So you
try and
go-
finish the conversation on the MRT. Okay, so we're gonna go.
I was just
around.
continuing on with that.
I know, you know, the hip bone's connected to the knee bone, right? It's
Right.
just all connected. Counselor Danberg, you had a question on that point?
I just wanted to comment to Jen. If we're looking at, let's say, if it doesn't work. And we need to go to something like a parking permit zone. We would need to make sure that we look at how we could also allow some commercial parking during the day when, you know, on streets that have it. Because if we're doing, you know, those cars aren't gonna have permits, and we don't know where they're from. So I don't want an answer, I just want
Yeah,
to lay it on the table.
yeah, so much of this is about proper management of the parking resources we have.
Yeah.
Right, and making the most use of those. In the commercial, in particular, you know, I know that's a topic that's come up before.
That could be the time of the day thing, which is on the street in front of my house. which is-
It's in my house, yeah,
Right.
we want to help out the
Right, after 6
the
p.m.,
village,
the residential permit kicks in, but during
Yeah,
the day.
that
Right.
would be good.
One thing on top of that too,
Sorry, you're
continuing on,
next.
okay,
You're on, it's
is
your time.
priority on the priority streets, they don't count anyways. So you can require parking and it won't affect your numbers for the MBTA community access.
Yeah, I just wanna backtrack here.
Yeah.
What's best and what's right for the village centers is separate and apart than meeting our MBTA communities requirements. They are connected, but they aren't the same thing. And as the policy recommenders to the policymakers sitting here, we very much recommend not requiring parking for all of the reasons that we listed. If we truly want open space, if we truly want an active and vibrant pedestrian experience, we should not require parking in our village center zones.
Yeah, and I think we would not want to, just because of the way the numbers play out for MBTA communities, require parking in the core of our village centers, you know, close to transit, those areas where we really want it to be pedestrian focused and mixed use, and we want those active storefronts, we want the open space. That is not where we would want to require parking, even if it doesn't change our numbers.
I think we would consider it in the MRT.
Yeah.
Where it's further from transit.
It's more of a
where there's little bit
neighborhood.
More land to play with. And I think we'll run those numbers for MRT at those tiers first. See how close we get to our staying just above our target and maybe as a first step, just to, because we can do the sensitivity analysis, now that'll be a slightly easier calculation first, how much room we have to play with. Does that make sense, Lauren? Okay.
You know what
Can't
you're
quite
doing tomorrow.
get me under the table.
Counselor Wright, did you have more you wanted to say on the MRT?
Oh, yes. plenty.
Go ahead.
So, one thing which I started right here, which I think would be very, very helpful, is I'm comparing the proposed zoning to our current zoning. And I'm just gonna talk about MRT right now, and then when we come back and do the rest of it, I have a lot more to say on the other items. But, one of the things that we have here is the side setback is 7.5 feet, and right now you're upzoning SR1 to MR2 lots, which are between 7.5 and 12.5 feet. The side setback. Now, for MRT, the maximum height is 45 feet. Presently, we have 36 feet. So that's about a 25% increase in the height. Now, I get all the complaints about these, of the new builds. The biggest complaint is, oh my God, they built so close to my house. And I always say, well, that's what the zoning is. It just so happens that 20 years ago, they didn't build to the full out setbacks, but now they do. And people really feel that, and that's with 36 feet. And I think we should do the side setbacks for new builds at 10 feet, because you're going 25 feet or 25% taller, and you're still keeping the same setbacks. So I think that would be helpful. And people won't be.
But that's with a
happy.
pitch roof though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have to
but-
have a pitch roof.
But that's with the pitch roof. Well, some can be flat too, but.
Yeah, so right now, I think what you're hearing a lot is the big boxes that are built up to the setback, right? So we're only allowing 2 stories with a flat roof.
Well, the 30 feet is with a flat roof right now versus 36 is a pitch roof. So now you're allowing 45 feet with a pitch roof.
And most of that will be receding as a pitch.
And it also might be that, maybe that height for the MRT zone, given that it is all residential, it doesn't need the full 45 feet. Also, again, most buildings are significantly more than the 1,500 square feet. So it's not just that it's 7.5 feet from the lot line, and it's 36 feet tall. It's that it's also a footprint that's, 2,000, 2,500 square feet. So it's expanding out and going up. So I think there's a few ways we could work on this.
But like, and counselor in Ward 8, the house next door to her, if it was 25% taller than what it is now, it'd be that much worse. Yes, the footprint might be a little bit bigger, but it still would be
Smaller.
so, oh yeah, it's still so overwhelming.
And would that be an MRT zone?
Yeah, no, I'm just doing it as an example. Her house is not in the MRT zone, but I'm just saying in a neighborhood.
And you're
Where-
rarely gonna see that 45 feet. So it's the 2 or 2.5 stories that's gonna be the controlling factor. You're not going to max out those floor to floor heights for most buildings, just because that costs more. But what we wanted to do was add a bit of flexibility there.
Allow for the pitch roof pitch to
And-
not be constrained.
Yeah, and that there's actually usable space under that pitched roof, because right now, under the pitch isn't really much usable space under the existing code. We're trying to allow for additional units to get more than just 2 very large units or 1 very large unit. So that's why we're giving a little more space under the pitch. But you're not gonna see 45 feet for most things. And if you do, they would be maxing out the ground, every floor. And the pitch and how many.
So one can do.
So then why have it if they're not gonna
I
do
think
it?
that's a question. I think we were looking at this is originally coming from the opportunity that over time, things will change. And so you might want to allow for a higher floor to floor on the ground floor, because in 25 years from now, that corner lot may be a great opportunity for some local retail that would benefit from the higher floor to floor. But to your point, because we're talking about all residential, maybe it's worth looking at 12-foot ground floors, not 15-foot for the ground.
But we can include that study in our design study that we do, because in a pitched roof, the top 6-7 feet of that pitch is unusable for that 3rd floor anyway. So we didn't want to artificially tamp down architectural expression for pitched roofs. And I think in one of the slides, I think you had a diagram in your slide deck that showed the kind of wasted space at the top of a pitch. So, but we can, if 41 feet makes you happier, we can drill in if those number of feet are gonna make a difference.
A related question, the 15 feet, does that help to accommodate sloping sites? Or, are you taking in?
It could, we're still using average grade.
So the first floor is from grade, not floor to floor. Because,
The overall height is from average grade.
yes, okay,
Yeah.
but you're adding those, you're starting with the 15 feet, so you're thinking of that as coming from.
Yeah, and that could help with a sloping site.
Okay, and so, and going through again, comparing our present zoning to the proposed zoning. So I did like the maximum footprint, was 1,500 and I did a 25 by 60 house, so that would fit on a 3,750 square foot lot with the setbacks. Which is, our minimum lot size right now is 7,000 square feet, and here it's actually 3,400 square feet would be the minimum lot size. So I'd like to have it clear, and I was just looking here, the rear lot setback or rear lot subdivision. There's nothing in numbers saying, what's your minimum, things like that. And then subdivision of lots. That's another question, because I would like to see you can only subdivide lots as it is today, the requirements, so much frontage, so much size. And not have it be unlimited, that if you had a 12,000 square foot lot, you could subdivide it into, if it had a lot of frontage, you could subdivide into 3 lots type of thing.
But you would only be able to subdivide it if the lot was big enough that you could meet all the setbacks, including the 15-foot setback between buildings. So it's a kind of form-based set of rules that allows for subdivision, that you can only subdivide if.
So I did the math here.
Right.
And a 25 by 60, which is a 1,500 square feet.
Right.
And that would require a 3,400 square foot lot. Using the setbacks, and your shortest setback is 7.5 feet. So if they each have 7.5 feet, that's 15 feet between them. Onto multiple buildings on the lot. Right now, when we do the townhouses, multiple buildings, we require 25 feet separation all the way around, from the side and the rear setback in between buildings.
Not between buildings. We require in single family attached, we require, I think it's 25-foot setbacks, but it's the only zone where you can waive the setbacks. So without a variance. So they often get special permits to reduce those setbacks. The building to building separation right now in the code is only I think what we added as part of the garage ordinance is 6 feet between all buildings. So single family attached actually, and many times are all attached. Lately, we have been seeing versions where they are separating them into multiple buildings. But those setbacks can all be waived right now and often are.
I don't think there often are. The rear and the side setbacks on that second building, they've been, because I've been voting against it if it's not 25 feet. I mean, maybe it's 24.5
Yeah,
feet.
I think they ask most of the time. We try to discourage it when they.
But they don't get it.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go to the next one.
We're gonna, Counselor, we're gonna draw through the scenarios to clarify.
Okay. So in going through the document in GG, substantial renovation. I was surprised to see that it exceeds 50% of the assessed value of the building. I thought it was like 50% of the building increased or changed or whatever. I never knew we used assessed value. This is on page 4.
I know where it is. I saw that, and we have a different definition for the Tenant Communities Act and a different definition in the code. And that probably is not something that we need to talk about here as part of the MRT district. I'm wondering if we can sort of integrate some.
Okay, I mean, it's
put
part
some
of
ideas forward, but
MRT.
if we have
okay.
questions about small stuff like the definition and which one we're using and stuff, if we could take that offline, that would be helpful, because we have a lot of people who want to talk.
Okay, so the next thing is in the MRT, the only place that usable open space is lots greater than 30,000 square feet. So there isn't a lot of usable open space, and right now in the present zoning, so if you can compare it. Oh, I don't have this right here in front of me, but there is a number, and I would like to see.
All right, are you on MRT still?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm
yes.
sorry, you said lots over 30,000 square feet.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
I'm looking at the chart right
Got
here.
it, got it, okay.
On page 5. So unusable open space, so the only time we have any usable open space is on lots over 30,000 square feet. And especially with MRT, because these are in the neighborhoods. You know, you say, oh, the setback will give us some open space. Well, it would be, I think we should add some usable open space in the MRT. Let's see. And, what is our MRT? Okay, so now I'm going on to page 8 in site design standards. So, you did talk about multiple buildings on a single lot. So right here, number of buildings, and a special permit is required in the MRT district for multiple buildings on lot, except as modified through adaptive reuse. So what you're saying, so if you're gonna reuse the main house, you can add as many buildings within 15 feet of each other on the lot.
By site plan review,
By site plan review. Okay, and who is part of the site plan review?
the planning board.
The planning board. Okay, getting back to all residential lots now require 50% open space. And which we don't have any now in the MRT. And the MRT, maybe change it to 30% lot coverage. Right now, that requirement is 25% in our present zoning. There's a couple more.
Are you educating for open space?
Oh, yeah.
Open
I'm advocating
open
for
space and lot coverage requirements for MRT, that's what.
Yeah, because I mean, we're in a neighborhood. I'm not saying that that's needed per se on the VC2 and VC3. But for what it is now,
Yeah, we can take a look at it, and by the numbers you gave earlier. The smallest lot would be 3,400 square feet, so 1,500 square foot footprint, you would have more than 50% open space.
Based on the setbacks.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think something we would need to study and consider is the effect of parking requirements on that, because your usable open space will go down just by the amount of space parking does take up.
While you're hesitating, can planning address that concept in general of how the metrics work in the MRT district to provide open space? There's one other metric that we haven't discussed, which is, I'm forgetting what you call it, but it's the percent of the facade, relative to the width of the site. And I think that also minimizes it. It means on many sites that if your setback on one side is 7.5 feet, your setback on the other side is much greater. Could you just describe?
For
what-
MRT,
What
this in general.
in general?
I think it's most important in MRT.
It's
But we don't
worse
have
than
that
MRT.
facade.
We don't have.
No.
requirements.
You're not doing that in MRT.
no,
No, because that's forcing.
Why?
Well, because that's
It's too urban of a
yeah,
requirement,
because it's a minimum requirement,
right?
the facade build out. So
Okay.
because we're limiting, you're saying a certain percentage of your frontage needs to all be building.
We don't think that's appropriate in
No,
MRT. It'd
no.
be fine to have more open space on
Yeah.
the side.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's a minimum.
Yes,
Got it. And you're not proposing
Not for
to
MRT.
have a maximum in MRT.
no, in MRT, you're really constrained by the footprint. That
Okay.
1,500 square foot footprint is relatively small.
Right.
So you are going to end up with a good bit of the lot. as
So this
open
is
space.
part of what you would study though, as you look at the economics. Which, we need to look at and the metrics hand in hand for that district.
Right,
Because the
How you-
streetscape is important to us, right?
yeah, how you play with let's take the new build, for example. You know, the likely proportions of a 1,500 square foot building to get a certain number of units per floor. I don't think it's gonna be, it's less like it's gonna be long and skinny, it's gonna be a little bit more rectangular looking, and whether it's turned this way or this way, you're probably gonna have the short end facing in front of it, because most lots are deeper than they are wide, and so. And then we've already taken a first high level look at this, but we can look at that 1,500 square feet relative to different lot sizes to calculate how much coverage there is and to show, to kind of demonstrate what that looks and feels like on a range of more typical lot sizes.
So Council Wright, is it fair to say you have some concerns about the metrics for MRT? We're going to be studying those metrics again.
With plants like the
more
ones you
so.
draw.
And so maybe we could move on from there.
Okay, I have some more questions or comments or questions. Okay,
Okay.
So the
Well,
next
leave
one-
time for other people to.
I know.
to weigh in, but go
well,
ahead.
if it was more clear, I wouldn't have as many questions. On page 13, when you're talking about 50% addition to the building, and I was wondering why you came up with 50%. What's
Because there was a concern, our original proposal was 400 square feet
Yeah.
max.
Yeah.
And there was a concern, I think, from some of the councilors too, that was too limiting, since we wanted to encourage rehabilitation of existing buildings and not new builds, and so. We just thought intuitively, if it was ever more than half and you had to set it back at least 20 feet from the front. That would encourage the market to choose that path.
okay?
But anything bigger than half the footprint would be. Like the addition eating the original thing, just intuitively.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
we've seen that, that's why we got 4-to-1 ratio a long time ago. Because the addition made.
Ate the build a house.
So,
Yeah, we can use the addition can never eat the house at 50%. Especially if it's pushed off the front.
So one of the things though, with the 50% and limiting it to 6 units, I think it could go even higher for the really big houses. So, you know, if a house is over 6,000 square feet, then it's 1,000 square feet per unit type of thing. Because you might end up with a house that's 10,000, not a lot of them, but you may end up with a house.
Would the rest of the councilors support that?
I don't know. Well, no, you're still having the same size house footprint.
Right,
It's the number of units that are in there. And we're gonna take a look at some form of possible parking in there, so.
yeah, we can go on the hunt through GIS with those really big examples and take a look at that.
Okay, so the other thing is with the 50% addition, what I'd like you to add is what is in our rules for detached ADUs as part of 6.7.1.E.3. Exterior alterations to an existing accessory structure or the creation of a new accessory structure are permitted provided they are keeping with the architectural integrity of the existing structure and or the principal dwelling in the lot and the residential character of the neighborhood. Something like that. So you just don't plop this box.
That's a
onto
little bit,
something.
the issue is that is discretionary for an as-of-right zoning like that. We try to use metrics that are unambiguous for as-of-right zoning. That gets into discretionary territory. That language.
We had trouble with that when we put that ordinance together and we made concessions to certain of our colleagues, but I think, you know. We understood that also from ISD.
John Lochek.
Right.
Well, we can put it in and then, you know, if we get a lot of pushback, you can change or whatever. I just don't want to just see box. And then you have this beautiful Victorian and you just have a box as a separate.
Let's wait, if we could hold off on stuff until we get the design studies, which is, we'll see our first meeting in June. If we could wait on any other questions that have to do with assumptions or on particular metrics or, you know, text or so forth. Let's see what the studies tell us.
Okay, and then. So I just want to be clear, so on page 20 in the presentation that we got today. So you said in mass law, you only need one form of egress for 12 or less, or less than 12?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of caveats there. You can, if a multifamily residential building is fully sprinkled. And that single means of egress is fire rated. And as it exits directly to the exterior, you only need one means of egress.
Okay,
And so. That would mean probably that any existing stair in a single family house wouldn't count because it wouldn't
okay,
be a fire separated egress.
okay.
Right.
Well, if you're renovating right
So
now.
again, I'm gonna say,
or in-
let's wait till we get the
Okay.
design stage, because you're
Yeah.
gonna see what the requirements are. You know, there's a certain amount of square footage that's gonna be necessary for vertical circulation in order to provide egress for the different units. But please wait on these
Okay.
questions,
One
and
more.
I really want to beg you, because you've been talking for 20 minutes, and I
Yeah.
would like to go to the next person.
I just
know
have
you
one real quick thing,
Okay, go ahead.
comment, well, besides that, if you have more than three or more units, you gotta put in a sprinkler system if you're renovating right now. And the other question, so on page 20, when you're talking about the MRT, so it sounds like because we're adding all these additional buildings, so there'll be a higher value on those lots that are in MRT possibly. And that would probably be also higher taxes on those.
I don't know about that.
Well, if they're higher value,
We don't necessarily know.
okay,
We're studying the economics of it right now. The underlying zoning has a pretty high value currently.
okay. So this is it for MRT, and I'd like to go through the other ones
Let's
tonight
see.
too. I know
We're
that
also
right now.
leaving here by 10 o'clock, so I would like to give other folks equal time, but not necessarily all on this topic. Okay, I'm gonna go to President Albright and then Councilor Leary, or do you want to go the other way, Rand? No, I just, are you ready? Oh, Councilor Leary,
Okay.
let's go.
Thank you very much. I feel like I'm holding my breath. I'm not gonna mention parking, but you know how I feel. And so I sent you guys some questions earlier, so I'll just go over those. And one of them was, I thought the 1,500 square foot was very limiting for MRT, and I thought people would default to underlying zoning, so that was one of my concerns. And I know it's a very delicate balance between the building footprint and usable open space, which I think is important, and parking, which I don't think is as important as the other two, because we do want to build more housing units and hopefully more affordable, smaller housing units. And that's really one of the big things I'm thinking of, that and sustainability and things like that. So what about using lot coverage rather than the specific footprint size? That was one of my, with MRT.
Right.
And, because I really wanted to encourage that missing middle, you know, the 4 or 6 units. That I think might work well, especially on maybe that Route 9 corridor there, but in other areas. And I.
We're using the VC one along
Yeah.
with nine. We're allowing the 4,000 square foot footprint along with nine.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought there was MRT along there too.
There's a little bit where it's not actually fronting Route 9. So
Okay.
there's some significant grade changes in a couple of spots. So when we did pull out some lots and make them MRT, where they're more in a neighborhood that's adjacent to Route 9 than on Route 9.
Okay. And you're
So it's
still,
mostly VC 1 with some VC 2 and a bit of VC 3 along Route 9.
okay. So anyway, I wanted to get more information about how we can balance, get the 1,500 square foot. I just think it's too constraining and won't work, and we actually won't get what we want. With that.
That's exactly what, we're going to be looking at in addition to the conversions here. I think we're really trying to find, in addition to bringing the city into MBTA community compliance, we are wanting to create a district that will create kind of house scale multifamily housing that will be built. And I think we're getting close, right?
Yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress.
I think we're getting close. We need to make sure it works. I think as Tim has mentioned, right now 1,500 square foot footprint, which is what MRT is proposing at 2.5 stories, gets you a little over 4,000 square feet of development. Breaking that into, 3 units, thinking about circulation, 1,200 square foot units, maybe a little under. We have to think about what the underlying zoning also allows, which we're seeing 7,000 to 9,000 to 10,000 square feet for 2 units. That's what we're seeing. So
The other half of it protect.
so we're working on,
Enormous units.
we're working on those numbers, but I think we are going in a direction for MRT where there's going to be a viable pathway for saving and preserving existing building and converting it. And those may produce sometimes somewhat large luxury units because it's expensive to convert. But we want to preserve the buildings as well, and that's the trade-off. There also may be an opportunity for new construction where 1,200 square foot units, 1,500 square foot units are being built that are priced well below what we are seeing. Homes that will be affordable to a different subset of people that we're typically seeing. That's what we're trying to get at MRT. That's what we believe we can allow. And I think we're really talking about a significant opportunity here, a market that doesn't exist not only in Newton, but really doesn't exist in many places across the region because the zoning doesn't allow it.
Right.
We are close, and we're going to come back with those numbers and those recommendations.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. The other thing I wanted to know about was, could you recalculate the MBTA unit capacity closer to the minimum requirement of the 8,330 units as opposed to the 10,000 units? I just think that people would be more comfortable with that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I have no, from what the discussions we've had over these many months now, I feel confident that we are going to meet the MBTA communities without too much of a problem with that balance between the quarters that have been created since our last meeting and the village centers. I think there's a balance there.
Yeah, and we wanted to come in with a bit of a buffer, because
Yeah.
as we have these discussions, there's going to be tweaks. Talking about the parking, that could significantly drop our numbers just doing that, not touching any of the area. As we start to really dig into the maps, and there may be some areas where folks think that's not the appropriate zoning, that shouldn't be included. So we wanted to make sure that there was room now as we were going to have these discussions to make some of those changes.
Okay. Well, that was my major concern. We're talking about MRT right now.
Yes, we
I'm
are.
gonna stick to what the chair is asking us.
Thank you. And so succinctly. So, I wanted to put on the table just for people to think, I docketed an item today just to get it in under the wire, and I'm gonna pass it around to the committee members at least tomorrow. And we can't do it for a while, but we might be able to start it this year, which is to take a look at the metrics in the underlying zoning in the MR zones. We know they don't work. We don't like the result of the giant 2-family boxes right up against somebody's house, or seeming to be right up
No one
against.
likes us.
Nobody likes that.
No, those are things.
So, and, well, it's, what we can do this relative to what we're doing now. If we're trying to compete with the underlying zoning but we want to do what's right for the district ultimately. So, I thought we should, as our next step, or one of our many next steps, to take a hard look at the underlying zoning and the metrics that we allow by right in our MR zones. So I'll send that around. I had a suggestion from the planning department. I'm going to edit it a little bit and send it around tomorrow, and edits welcome and signers welcome.
And just one
So
other
thanks for
point,
that.
Zach was mentioning that the units that are going to be kept and preserved are likely to be larger or more expensive units.
It could be. I mean, I think you can go, it's expensive to preserve a building. You want to look at those numbers. So if there is a very large Victorian, it might not convert it to 6 units because the added cost of doing all of that and the circulation, but it might convert to 3. And those 3 would probably be decent size. But
You might lay out better for not the maximum 6 because of the existing
Okay.
plan.
those units will be cheaper than the one large Victorian.
Right.
I was also thinking the benefit of building new is in terms, I'm thinking of our carbon footprint here and
Sure.
our climate action goals is that we'd be able to build very efficient.
Yeah.
Probably all electric buildings, which would also be cheaper for the people who are living there, right?
Right.
And that's something to think about. I'm curious about how much we could actually, can we calculate how much that might impact our ability to meet our climate action goals?
Hmm.
9 of us, not just MRTs.
But does it too. But don't we need to meet those goals if we're doing a gut and adding 50% to the house?
But it's harder and more expensive to do that, and it's more likely that it would get done with new builds are just much easier. So there's a balance there. I'm not suggesting we not save a nice house. I'm just saying there is opportunity for us with some of the total new builds and maybe that.
But don't they have to meet some of those metrics if they're doing more than?
Yeah, they do.
50%?
They
They
do.
do.
We have,
They
them, you know, the HERS ratings and things like that.
Which
yes.
is why they might not do it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
President Albright.
so I have, a lot of my issues have been dealt with already, so, can't help it, I have a parking issue that I have to raise. So when we talk about the tools of using parking permits, I've had conversations with the police department about parking permits with respect to the winter parking ban, and they're not that keen on enforcing more parking permits, especially at night. So just something to keep in mind that those tools may be, we may think they're great, but other parts of our city administration may not like them as much. So just something to keep in mind is, will it really work as a tool or not? The other parking thing I wanted to raise was, I like the idea of the public parking to take care of the parking needs, and shared parking. But I think what we found is that the insurance issues of one building versus another building, that they're not that interested in private owners don't want to share their parking because they don't want to have the insurance problem of somebody, you know.
A couple different types of shared parking. So what we were trying to do before was more commercial shared parking. And that's where you have any person can come park there and pay to park there. I think that's a little different than two private landowners coming to an agreement to share parking. It's not opening it up necessarily to everyone. I think the public parking is probably the best solution for commercial parking. But for residential parking or for employees of a nearby business, you may be able to see private landowners make arrangements that are more efficient.
And just quickly, other communities do this. If the value of the parking is enough, it'll happen. I mean, look at Brookline, there are churches who rent out their parking for an incredible amount of money. They figured it out because the value is there. And so if you need that much parking and the value is there.
I hope you're right. That's my honest hope. It hasn't materialized yet.
Well, that just means that people don't value parking as much as they think.
No, I think they value being sued. They worry about being sued more than they value the
But
parking.
why is it happening in these other communities?
I don't know. I can't answer.
The First Baptist Church on Chapel Street in Northampton shares parking with the Chapel Ridge Park.
Yeah, and then Newtonville,
Yeah,
the church that's now going to be, they rented to next door and to businesses during the week.
All right, so
And that was just
Very
Sorry.
good. That's good. There we go. That's very good.
being done.
Question about the
Sorry.
50%. I think you said if your footprint is larger than 1,500, you get 50% of whatever your footprint is.
Correct.
Any footprint, you get 50%, but you obviously could get at least 1,500 since that's the new construction
Okay,
bill, but whatever your existing footprint is, you can add
So-
up to 50%.
will you model that, something like that as well, just so we can see?
We'll run some what ifs.
Okay. That may be everything that's left of my questions. So the one last one about bikes. So I was impressed by your three pages or so of bike regulations. That was very impressive compared to the 21 pages. There are 3 of them are all about bikes. So maybe you went a little overboard, but you don't require them for less than 10 units. So I thought, why is that?
It just it figured that the smaller projects, you know, I think they can handle they can handle bike parking differently. When you start to get to larger unit and development, you want to create the space for that. You want to create the separate, you know, particularly for, you know, parking for units, right? You want to, should they be indoors? Should they be, you know, under lock and key? Those types of requirements kick in at a larger project, and then a smaller project, it can be handled a little bit differently.
So you think there'll be plenty of space somewhere on the site for bikes?
I think so, and I imagine there'll also be space that the developer will carve out for parking of cars as well, even if they're not required.
Okay, all right. So I think that's all I have.
All right, thanks. I'm gonna go to Counselor Ryan and then Counselor Krinsman, who's on Zoom.
Okay, yeah, a lot of my questions were answered, but I want to go back to clarification on something. So in MRTs, and you were talking about the buildings and the village centers and the facades. The way I thought I heard it was they didn't have to, you know, stagger up the balconies and make them different phase, or am I not hearing that right?
They could still, I think the only difference is we wouldn't require the buildings in the MRT to maximize their frontage because they're in less urban, more residentially neighborhoods, but you could still spend them on, you could still include bays and porches outside of the footprint. So all the incentives to do all of the architectural goodies would also apply to the MRT.
All right, so it does,
Yeah,
I mean,
it
you can't
does.
just put a box in the flat face building.
Exactly.
Okay, and I want to ask you a question about the 100-foot, which is kind of the same. So between Beacon Street and let's say Pleasant Street and Newton Center, all those businesses, and let's say we built up on top of them. Is that 100 feet?
Like,
Anybody else?
Sorry, I didn't
I
follow the
think it
whole
is
question.
100 feet.
Well, what I'm saying is we already have, even though they're old and they're 1950s or 1920s, they're, you know, they're flat, there's no real, they're all the same, they're all, you know.
Are you looking?
Building?
Yes.
Zach's gonna make the call.
Where did you say?
It's-
Along Beacon.
My point is that we have these old business districts now that are the same, they're just storefront after storefront, nothing's, you know, they're all the same, they're not different, they're just different.
So you're talking about the center business district.
So what I'm saying is, and if, let's say you tore them all down and rebuild what we're talking about. Those would have to be under the new.
Well, there's two things that would control their scale. First is the maximum footprint. And so whether it was a VC2 or VC3, I don't know exactly how we've mapped the area that you're talking about. The footprint and the proportion the building would have to have would limit its length to begin with. But to make sure that, especially in the VC3, that a 15,000 square foot footprint wouldn't get too long, we require after 100 feet a break that is at least 10 feet wide and 7 feet deep. Now, why 7 feet deep? Because that's a good dimension for balcony, make this big in there or something. So it's just to keep a flat facade from being longer than 100 feet.
That answered my question.
Does that answer it?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you know, Council Larry beat me to it, but parking, I don't know why we're requiring that everywhere. I know people disagree with us, but you know, how do we get to produce smaller units? Like, I will not give up on smaller units close to transit, no parking required. 1,000 square feet, I mean, left even. So if you don't have a parking requirement, I still think you'll draw students, new married couples, people just out of graduating from college, and elders wanting to downsize that don't drive anymore for other reason. And hopefully Newmo will last. The way I've been here my whole life and I've seen these Newmos come and go, but well, as long as I can remember. So we're talking, I'm 70, so we're talking 60 years, shuttles and Newmos and all this. And I just hope the way it's, because we need it. We need it. I think it plays into all our plans on MRT too. Because if you don't want to have a car in the village center, then once in a while you're going to need a car. You need to, they used to be zip cars, but they're getting expensive now. But another way to go about it. So, and then the other thing is I worry about the height on. I want the extra height for the extra affordable unit. I know in debate now if it's really gonna work. But I worry about the ground level, what is really ground, what is really grade. But I see it in the residential neighborhoods where, grade is a half a story out of the ground before we start living. And then the other problem is the peak. You get the flat roofs are fine. I mean, I can show you in residential, but I just don't want this to happen if where people really don't want a lot of height, but we're compromising on size, 4 or 5 stories instead of 7, 6 or 7. But the peaks in residential, I'm sorry, are finished bedrooms. I heard you say, but they are. I was in one 2 days ago.
Go up in the roof and then, yeah.
Yeah, they have dormers on each side and they're 2 finished bedrooms, which makes it 3 full livable floors. Not counting the basement. So I just don't want us to be giving away a half story that is really another story. And you might say, I'm talking residential to village center, but whichever way you look at it, it can happen. And I don't want that to happen because we gotta really be careful with the constituents, with our residents, especially our long-term residents that want to preserve the village senses a certain way. We have to get some more height for the housing. But, let's not, let's make sure it's really what it is. And that's all I got.
Okay. I'm gonna start with some folks online, but Councilor Krinsman, I think we are turning a corner from the MRT into sort of the bigger picture. And maybe we've spent a fair amount of time, but if you could weigh in on the MRT and then folks who are speaking from now on, why don't we just open it up because it's getting late.
Would you reconsider the committee on the second part too?
Oh, yeah.
No.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So Councilor Krinsman, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to start by saying again how excellent I think this work is. I really think we're honing in on it. I think we're getting really close. Zach, I think you were the one who said, we're getting really close. I agree. It's looking really good. I appreciate all the work that has gone into this. I particularly like the stuff around the bays, the awnings, the balconies. It looked, at least from the draft zoning, like canopies were excluded from some of the areas, like maybe building footprint. Was that intentional or unintentional?
So what ends up happening is, in particularly the VC2 and VC3 zones, we have a 0 front lot line requirement. We want the buildings to be pushed up to the street. But we also don't want to end up with just, a flat vertical surface. So let's just take, a building in VC2 that has a 10,000 square foot footprint. If there's a situation where that building is pushed up all the way to the, to the lot line at 0, and it goes up, we want to allow for bays above the first floor to extend into the right of way. So you create, architectural articulation and not just a flat facade. And we want to incentivize those. So those would be allowed beyond the 10,000 square foot footprint.
If we should set a height then.
There is.
12 feet or no? it's-
Yeah.
And canopies, if you're talking about canopies and awnings, we did end up combining those definitions since the first draft. And
That was
they
another
are-
question. I didn't see a definition of canopy, so, okay.
Yeah, so we didn't remove canopies. We just combined it with awnings, because as we worked through it with ISD, whereas they didn't need to be separate definitions.
And those bays or balconies that you use as a bonus, there's dimensional requirements there, right? It's not just that you can just do some weird, crazy big
Right.
extension. It has to meet these, and we want that, right? Because we
Right.
don't want flat facade.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Two other questions. I think they're quick. One, I apologize because I think you went over it, and Jen, I know you mentioned this in your presentation, and I know it came up again in the conversation. I just didn't understand it, so I apologize. But why does the 4-unit proposal count towards the housing maximum, but not the 6 units? Can you explain to me what the parameters are of the guidelines that exclude the 6?
Sure, so for the MBTA communities law, you essentially have to assume a blank slate. And you get to count whatever the zoning would allow on that blank slate. So when you are talking about converting an existing building, you're not talking about a blank slate. So because that zoning is dependent upon there being an existing building, it being large enough to convert to those multiple units, it doesn't count. You only get to count what anyone could come in and build blank slate on that lot.
Okay, it makes sense when you say it. I don't remember reading that in either the law or the guidelines, but it makes sense when you say it, so I appreciate it.
Yeah,
And thank you.
we talked through it with the state because we weren't initially, that wasn't our initial assumption either. So we have talked through it with them to better understand, and that is the requirement.
I think the other thing is we landed on 4 units for the new build. Because we needed to get to 4 units to then have zones that were at least 15 units an acre based on our analysis. So we
Yep.
reverse engineered from 4 units per lot to then think how many more units would we have to allow to incentivize reuse. So we reverse engineered to the 6 units. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. And it actually sort of segues into my other and final question, which is, I liked a lot of what Councilor Leary had to say, and one of the things she asked about was the 10,000 units that are enabled by this draft zoning as opposed to the 8,300. I forget the exact numbers that we're required to build. My question is, do we get to over 10,000 because we have applied MRT or some other zone in more places than we have to, or is it a result of complying with the 15 units per acre, the 50%, all the sort of other requirements of the housing choice law, that when you sort of, configure all these areas and do what we want around as many places as we want, that it's going to necessitate getting up that high or, that many parcels?
If we rolled back a little bit, the contiguous zone, which includes a lot of MRT, we would still have a contiguous zone that was 50% of the total. So I would say that there's a fork in the road here, which is either we can add in some parking requirements to the MRT, which is one thing.
Oh, we should talk about parking. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other is that we could pull in a little bit the how far we extend the MRT in that one contiguous zone. I think our initial assumption is, it based on feedback over the next couple of months, it might have to be a little bit of both, but we wanted to have enough leeway, as Jen said a little bit earlier in the meeting, that we wouldn't need to say every time someone had an idea, well, we can't change anything. That's not a very good place to be.
I mean, it feels like we might be able to sort of trim, to get to what Councilor Leary was saying, which I agree with. I think it becomes a little bit more palatable politically, as you get closer to the 8,300 number, which is a consideration here. But I think it means that we can sort of trim you know, in a number of places. We may not be able to cut all from one place where we want because of the various requirements, but there's some sort of room where you can trim. And if you know, trim in one place, it means you have to trim in another, but we have the capability to do that and maybe, you know, refine this a little bit.
So the sensitivity thing that Councilor Baker's asked for,
Is a first step.
that is hugely a first step, because we're, you know, going down to one unit is gonna see our numbers drop tremendously.
I think we'll try that in the MRT only first. And see if we still stay north of the required target number. And we'll report back with some options, so. But I think Councilor Krinsman, that's an excellent summary of how we're thinking of spending the wiggle room. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm all set, Madam Chair. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilor Krinsman. So a few more folks online. Councilor Laredo, you're next, then Councilor Downs.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, colleagues. A couple of questions first, and then I want to just weigh in on the parking piece. What notice, Chair Crosley, are we planning to provide to all of the people, both renters and owners in the affected zones? Both the zone that we're talking about for the MART, and also for the VC1, VC2, and VC3. And I say that because we provide notice all the time in the land use process to folks who are directly affected. We're planning on having a public hearing, I think June 29th, after school is done for the year, after folks have started their vacations. So what notice, what written notice are we going to actually get to people?
The 26th is the date.
Forgive me, but what notice, the more important question is, what written notice are we getting to every affected household?
We don't have our communications person or engagement person here tonight, but when we did this last time, we did send notice to every property owner. I assume we would do that again.
Well, we have a much larger pool of folks here, much larger. Before we were talking about very limited areas. And can I just add one other, may I add one other thing here? I appreciate that it's very important to notify property owners. That's how we typically do things. But at least for businesses, and we're affecting, that's what this is about, is affecting a whole bunch of businesses. We need to communicate with them as well, and they're almost invariably renters. So I think it's critically important that we have a very clear game plan, not just a public relations plan, but a real plan to provide people with actual notice of what's going on, including access to the memos that have come forward from planning, the maps, all of that stuff. So Mr. Lamella, if you have some comments to that, I'd appreciate it.
No, I think it's a great point, and it's something that's always a struggle. We reach out to our business partners as much as possible to amplify, noticing. We attend chamber meetings regularly, and their subcommittees regularly. We work through those listservs to get notice out. We have an economic development commission that helps us, get notice out. We have an economic development director who has relationships with these businesses who, like you said, are renters. And of course, happy to work with you and anyone else on how we could, again, further and broaden that outreach.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Kyra, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we've spent the last 2 years sort of building a database of people who we've worked with on this, who we've contacted, who we've reached out to, who we've met with. So we're going to build upon all of that along with any sort of written mail noticing to folks. So we are hoping to get the word out in as many ways as possible, but we've spent quite a bit of time now sort of building up those contacts.
Okay, but if I'm in one of these new zoning choice or housing choice zones, okay, and I don't, unlike the 40 people on this meeting who pay deep attention to this, I don't know about that, and then all of a sudden I find out in October that you've rezoned my property. I'm gonna be pretty upset. And now maybe my fault for not paying attention to city affairs, but I think we as the representatives of the residents of the city, we can't just say we're going to try to use a lot of channels. We have got to make sure that each and every person affected by this gets noticed so that they can weigh in. Otherwise, we're gonna, I think Councilor Krinsman talked about the political aspect of this. Otherwise, I think we're gonna have tremendous backlash from folks who are gonna say, you just rezoned my lot and I didn't know about it. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I don't think we need to respond right now, but I am very concerned about it.
Okay, are you gonna go to the content?
That's where I'm going right now, but the information piece, Madam Chair, I think is critical. But let me just ask about the parking piece, because I think Mr. Lamel, you said earlier that, you know, we don't want parking in front of buildings, or maybe you said that, Ms. Kyra. I 100% agree with that. That's just a very bad way of promoting our village centers. My issue, and I'm frankly struggling with this, is Ms. Kyra, you talked a lot about how public shared parking is really the ideal model to both provide parking in village centers and avoid having parking requirements. But my question is, that sounds great in theory. Where are we going to do it in practice? That's question number one. And then Mr. Lamel, a question for you is, you had weighed in about how in Brookline they're able to do shared parking and so forth. We had difficulties here. I would suggest you have two issues in play there. One is, if you have a larger corporate owner, they're institutionally, a bank, for example, is just not going to want to deal with this. They won't. You might tell them there's profit, they're not going to care. Number two, you really ought to be talking to some insurance agents to understand the insurance piece of it, because that's a critical component. And if there's ways around that you can encourage the shared use, you ought to understand what their constraints are, because that's a real world that those people live in, rather than, you know, our theoretical, let's all share parking. But Ms. Kyra, I'd like to go back to you. What is your solution there for us?
So I want to be clear, when I talk about public parking, I'm talking about the public parking that primarily exists now. We have a number of city-owned public lots. We've got public street parking, and that's the solution for commercial businesses. And that's how our village centers operate today. When you go to most businesses in a village center, you cannot park on that property for that particular business. There are exemptions. There are some places that have some parking. But in general, you're looking for a public parking spot. And then ideally, you're maybe visiting more than one establishment within that village center, rather than everyone having their own parking where you can only park for that use. And you have to get back in your car and drive if you want to go to a restaurant and a store in the same village center. For residential, it's a little different. We believe the market will provide the parking that that particular location and that type of housing reasonably demands. Now, we're not saying all of a sudden everyone's going to start sharing parking. What we're saying is, by unlocking some of these existing zoning restraints, you're allowing for that to happen. There are still other hurdles. But you still could see two adjacent property owners that are able to come to an agreement and share some parking for their residents or their employees. But we're not saying everyone is going to do this, or that that insurance liability is just going to go away. We're saying by removing restrictions and zoning hurdles, we're allowing for more flexibility in how parking is handled.
So I guess in response, we did, as you recall, tried the shared parking issue in the land use process. We were we were encouraging that and had some real issues there. I guess I appreciate what you're saying about the public parking piece, but I'm thinking, for example, of Newtonville. A fair amount of public parking right now takes place in a private lot, i.e. the Star Market parking lot, okay? And if anybody who ever, hell, we all go there. Why? Because it's easy to get in, it's easy to get out, and you don't have to pay. Very simple. I hope something's going to get built in that lot in the not too distant future. It's probably not a good use of space. But what are we going to do when we lose that? And we now have more commercial space and more residential space, because after all, our whole goal here is to increase both housing and commercial space in our village centers. And I'm positing the question. There may not be a right answer to it, but I'm troubled by, I guess, I'm troubled by the assumption that it's somehow going to be there, but we literally have no plan for it. And I you don't have to respond right now. I'm positing that as a question to our group.
Yeah, sure. So free parking is always going to win. And if you have free parking, that's where most people are going to park. There's a lot of vacant spots in the Austin Street lot. So if you are no longer able to park for free at Star Market, which I do as well, even though I know the Austin Street lot is there. And
you should never admit that, Miss Kyra, in a public meeting, ever.
Car's going to get towed next time. I have studied the plans of that Austin Street parking lot, probably more than most people, and I still park at Star Market because it's easy and free. Were that Star Market parking to go away, I think you would see more people park in the Austin Street lot where there's vacant space. Pricing is how a lot of communities also deal with parking demand and supply. And when you have more residents living in your village center, you're not needing as much parking because people are walking to many of these businesses.
I have to push back on that statement. We have the same number of folks living more distantly from the village centers. We want them to come to our village centers. We don't want them to go to the Chestnut Hill Mall. So we have to accommodate the same number of folks at least. And if we're going to have more people in the city, which this plan calls for, we want that someone who lives in Newtonville to travel to West Newton, to travel to Newton Center, to travel elsewhere. So we just have to plan for that. And I'll leave it at that. I just have one other question. I have to say I'm remain struck by the idea that we're on one hand trusting our developers to just do what's right, but when it comes to bikes, we seem compelled to tell them what to do. And I'm just going to put that out there as an observation that we can't have it both ways. One final request from my colleagues. I would view whatever we're given with a degree of healthy skepticism. And I don't mean that as a negative to our planners, not at all. But I think our job should be, and I know they're doing this already, is to try to poke holes in it, because that's what our developers are going to do. They're going to poke holes in it. They're going to do whatever they can to maximize their profit. And they're not really going to care as much about what our goals are. So I'll leave it at that, but I do think that's a critically important thing for us to be doing. I know you're doing it, but collectively as a council, we need to be doing that. And we need to be doing that, frankly, more than I think we are right now. Thank you.
I'll respond quickly to
Yes, go ahead, please.
Vehicular parking versus bike. We tell developers what we think they should do or what they have to do for a lot of things. There are some areas where our interests are aligned. So areas where providing more of something costs a lot more money. That's where our interest with developers and their bottom line is aligned. So with parking. For other things, we're telling them what to do based on what we want to see in our policy goals. And I think one of our policy goals is to make it easier for people to bike rather than drive, which is why we think they would provide bike parking because their market probably demands it. But we want to make sure they do. And we want to make sure they provide good, secure, safe bike parking in appropriate locations. When it comes to vehicular parking, they're spending a lot of money for every space that they build, and they do not want to build one more than they need. So that's where our interests are more aligned, where we can trust the market. But on all other things, or most other things, we should be dictating what we want to see.
Thank you, Ms. Carrera. Counselor Downs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm kind of taken by how my colleagues, particularly Councillor Baker, has more confidence in the predictive powers of city council than I do. We only revisit our parking requirements every 5 to 50 years. The market studies this all the time. This is what they, this is how they make a buck. And so they're more likely to be better at it. That's one thing markets are really good at. I really think this is great work, and I'm happy that planning is talking with the state on the MBTA zonings. I like what I'm hearing about consolidated public parking. I think that's going to be kind of the key to getting out there. And I do park when I drive to Newtonville. I do park at the meters in the public lot. It's really easy and it's covered. It's great. It's going to be more difficult to meet our housing goals and our MBTA goals and our aesthetic goals and our climate goals if we mandate parking. Things just aren't going to look as good. I think the market will be providing it. And just to Councilor Laredo's comment about bike parking, I can't tell you how many times I've given businesses plans for how to construct bike parking, where to construct it, what they might want to think about when they're doing it. They're mostly clueless about bike parking. And I read over the zoning, and it gives some really helpful guidance on how to do the bike parking and where it might want to be and how much of it should be covered. And that, you will need room for cargo bikes as people buy electric cargo bikes and want to carry things more than just themselves, more than sports. They want to take the kids to school on a bike. But I want to step back a little bit. We have bigger goals in this zoning. We have bigger goals for the city. We want to meet some very strict, very immediate climate goals. We want to see economic development in our village centers, and we need resilience on both fronts to be able to do that. We need quite a bit of legal wiggle room in order to meet unexpected changes in climate and economics. And I have to tell you, over the weekend, I heard that some state and federal officials feel that Newton is not doing enough, and that they are feeling kind of taken. They don't want to be talking with us about railroad stations that need accessibility improvements. They don't want to talk about any more money for the Green Line in Newton. They're just feeling like we're blowing them off. So I think we might be better off overcorrecting than trying to hit that 8550 whatever number, but adding in a little bit more room for a few more people, so that we don't have downstream consequences and we don't miss some of these other really big goals we have. I worry about older buildings and the emphasis on preservation alone. Some of our older buildings are not lovely Victorians. They are ugly. They were built cheaply. They will be very hard to save. And they probably shouldn't be saved. Fixing them, as I've heard planning say, is going to be more expensive than building new in many cases. So I'm glad you're looking at the financial feasibility. I'd also want to look at whether we would be meeting our housing goals by putting such a strong emphasis on housing. On preservation. Because I do sympathize with it, but I also think that our bigger goals are really the climate goals and the economic development goals and the meeting our affordable housing mandates. And that does it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Downs. And let's see, Counselor Bowman and then Lucas, and I'm going to bring it back to the committee.
Thank you very much. I'll start by associating my comments with those of Counselor Downs. I completely agree that while I want to preserve what's good in our existing housing stock, I am concerned about over-reliance on that and overemphasis on that, missing the point of and our ability to meet our climate goals and our housing goals and others. I'll start with a very simple question, and it's maybe not one you can answer tonight, but I want to know specifically where triple deckers, the classic Boston, Massachusetts triple decker, 3 full stories, can be built in our village centers, because I don't see where that's enabled or incented anywhere in this process. Much like I asked about the fourplexes, I don't see the fourplexes being built on 1,500 square feet. I'm very interested, actually, I'm reaching out in my network to see if I can find someone who lives in either of the 2 homes that you've shown as the 4+ units that are on 1,500 square feet, because I just don't see those as viable. I have a lot of questions when it comes to MRT about the adaptive reuse section. Some I'd like you to consider. I think there's something in there about not being able to alter the exterior, the front of a building. Frequently, many of our beautiful Victorians, much like my own house, had things like their front porches taken off and other items added to buildings that are not historical, not in keeping. So I wouldn't want to keep us from being able to improve the front of the, if we're going to keep the historic homes, let's have a process where somebody, even if they have to go to Newton Historic or something to restore something. I was able to restore part of a porch on my house, and it made a huge difference in the quality of my life, being able to sit down on the front porch, enjoy being able to sit out there and watch my neighbors go by, but also the look and feel and the historic nature of my house. So I don't think a blanket not being able to fix the front facade of a house is, I'd also add that to the same rebuilding. Again, my 1888 Victorian house had a side set of stairs, exterior stairs that needed to be rebuilt. And actually, I had to work with historic on that because they weren't historic to the house. They were awful. They needed to be rebuilt, but they ended up being the biggest issue that we had. And I wouldn't want to stop people from being able to do something that actually enhanced their house. And I also, the multi buildings, I do think that even in a new build, we ought to think about on those larger lots, somehow being able to not require somebody to go for a special permit. Because again, what we really don't want them to do is to go to the underlying zoning for the most part, because we know that the underlying zoning isn't working. If there are larger lots here, allowing multi-buildings, even in a new build, I think we should discuss being able to somehow do that within the special, in the review process as opposed to going to special permit. I'm less concerned about the usable open space on the MRT and more concerned about enabling the triple deckers and the fourplexes and the sixplexes. You know, as long as we're keeping with the setbacks, I think that should be fine. I agree with Councilor Wright when she made the comment about the number. Why are we limiting the number of units when we've already limited the building size and the setbacks? If we're going to use those types of controls, I don't think we should have to limit the number of buildings. We have many times in the city where a developer has come to us to propose 4 units or 6 units, and they end up getting shot down or a fear of going through the special permit process, and they end up building 2 very large units instead. It should not matter. If what we care about is what actually gets built in the end and what you're looking at and the fitting in with the neighborhoods, why do we care if they're 4 small units? I mean, I care more that they're 4 small units rather than 2 large units, but often the same size building, we have multiple times when this has happened where the same size building or even bigger got built and it's only 2 units. Let's allow, the 4 units and the 6 units to go forward. Let's see. Yeah, so I think those are most of my comments. I do have some specific comments about the bike parking. I think specifically I would suggest you go back and look at the street design guide that was done back in 2018, page 23. I think you just should lift out what was done on page 23. There's much more specifics about alignment and space and such. The city is filled with commercial parking that we've required. I'll just pick on Chestnut Hill Square. We have lovely bike parking, but in Wegmans, that's filled with shopping carts because we haven't designed it well so that bikes can park there. Or we put, Starbucks in Auburndale, the 2 hoops are so close together that you can only put 1 bike. The 2 hoops, and you can only put 1 bike on one side. So a pretty good job was done in that street design guide, page 23. Just adapt it, pick it up, because it all comes in all flavors. But the last thing I'll say is it's, I won't get into the specific here, but I was trying to look through the allowed uses, and I'm not sure all the allowed uses are there. Like I looked for one that's just around medical, like I saw them all actually in the bike parking. There was really good detail in the bike parking, but then when I looked from allowed uses, I couldn't find the medical offices and others that seem to be missing. So you might just want to check on that and make sure we have all allowed uses. Other than that, I do think we're going in the right direction, but I'm hoping that the next version of the MRT we're going to see is really focused on making sure that we have and we're enabling and encouraging all of the missing middle housing, the triple deckers, the 4-plexes, the 6-plexes, make sure that we're setting ourselves up to enable those to get done, because they're not getting done in these zones. Where are they getting done? So that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilor Bowman. I'm going to ask if the team can address 2 points. One, I think is really simple. I didn't take from the text or anything we've talked about that you're prohibited from renovating the facade of your big old Victorian or rebuilding the porch that was once there or whatever. So I think that shouldn't be a concern. Is that correct?
That's correct, because you can do a porch, you can do bays.
And so you can add that to the street facing facade and the 20-foot back and so forth. It's just that the addition.
The 50% contiguous kind of addition can't be on the front.
Right.
So you don't get carbuncles on the front.
Okay, so.
So in 8B.22, it says the exterior may not be the exterior front may not be altered. So just make that clear. If I misread that, it says no, and then it also says no rebuilding, renovation, or something of side facade, something around the side facade if it was going to,
Okay.
so there was something around that.
Let's make sure that's all very clear.
Yeah, that's a good catch. We'll take a closer look at that. We're trying to eliminate loopholes where you take something down to the studs and it, doesn't resemble at all what was there before.
Right. There's there's a building on Church Street where they've actually done a really nice job that they've rebuilt out the porch. They had something that was covered and they rebuilt it to be an open porch. It looks really nice, but I think you should look at that to say, even if it took a historical review, if you have a historic house, let somebody restore it to what makes it more.
The other point is, and I don't really want to have a whole conversation, I just would like the folks to comment, but the Historic Commission, it's still a building that's over X years old. And so there is a demolition review. I hope that's going to pass muster with the MBTA communities, but that's our
so
process.
there's still review of over 50% of if you're altering 50% or more of any facade, or if you're altering any key architectural features for a state or national register building. So there will still be that review for those buildings, but let us take another pass at the
I
language.
think we
to make sure
can
that
improve
there's
the language there. I think
flexibility.
the other piece of it is that if a developer is making a decision about renovating and rehabilitating existing structure with addition versus a new build, the marketability of the character of the existing building will be part of the decision. So if it's a nice Victorian house, chances are higher that that's marketable versus a structure maybe that we built more recently that's uglier, where the new build option is probably going to be more marketable than an unattractive, more recent build. So that's harder to predict, but that's one of the discussions we had with John about the choices the developers might make.
And then finally, Councilor Bowman's comment about whether a 3-family triple decker or 4-family duplex or whatever fits, that'll be the kind of thing you're
Right.
going to be looking at for our June meeting and drawing out.
And I mean, I think Zach provided rough numbers at the very beginning of his presentation, but the new build is a 1,500 square foot footprint, which translates to about 4,200 square feet at 2.5 stories. And so that can either be 4 smaller units at a little bit over 1,000 gross square feet per, or more likely probably a triple decker to get bigger units. So that the new build is really designed for 3 and 4 unit buildings.
Okay,
And to address that scale of missing middle,
so we'll see how that works in a
Exactly.
month.
but we'll draw through those.
Okay, just wanted to reiterate that because I'm not sure who was here at the beginning. And last but not least on Zoom is Councilor Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief, I promise. I think you had alluded to that there will be a public hearing on June 26th. Is that going to be the only public hearing for the Village Center MBTA zoning? Will it be one in the fall or?
Absolutely not. No, I said we were going to open a public hearing on June 26th. We're going to hold it open and resume in September.
Okay, good. Oh,
talked
sorry,
about
go on.
We hold public conversations over the summer, but I think, everyone's not comfortable with that, but we'll talk about it.
Okay, so you're going to hold it. That's fine. I think that's the right move. As far as alerting folks to the public hearing on June 26th, will the planning department announce this public hearing in their Village Center newsletter?
Absolutely.
Yes, and the mayor's newsletter, what we're hoping is tonight the committee votes to set the public hearing for that date so that we can start to publicize it.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's the right move. And following up on what a previous counselor said, Councilor Laredo said about our businesses that rent their space, they may not know about this. I also want to throw in that renters who rent their home, their residents, those are the people, I should say, who have the most to lose with zoning redesign. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers, and it's going to be the renters. They don't have a say of what their landlord or property owner wants to do with said property. And it's now by right. So as soon as they file the building permits, it's off to the races and they have to move out. So I would hope that someone is making an attempt to reach out to renters. I know Councilor Malky, I don't know if she's on this call right now, but we have docketed a change to a city ordinance to maybe require notices to renters as opposed to just property owners. So I just want to say that. Also going forward, looking at the models that we use, that we share to the public, we currently have renderings, partial renderings for Newtonville, Newton Corner, and Newton Highlands. Just wondering if there are going to be any more renderings for the MRT zone, the VC3 zones, or any other village center?
The renderings that we provided are kind of standard examples of what each of those zones allow. So that building typology is that's in that rendering. You should think about it. There's a VC3 in Newton Highland versus a VC3 zone in West Newton. You can think about that building typology, that rendering, and think about, that general mass and form would be, the framework allowed in the other VC3. Same thing for VC2, VC1, and MRT.
Okay, thank you. So were you going to say something?
Yeah.
We were, but we are going to be doing more visualizations of MRT to address the issues that have come up this evening. Councilor Wright, all of you have had questions about what does it look like with our design metrics for where an addition goes in an existing building? What does it mean to pick the addition route versus the new construction in terms of the urban form and the amount of open space we have? So those will all be visualizations that we're going to be doing as a kind of priority for design studies in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, so if you remember a few months ago, maybe 3 months ago, the Newtonville Area Council and the Waban Area Council, they produced their own renderings of what the village center would look like with everything built out. So you're not going to do something like that, right?
No, we're not. And this has come up a number of times. We've had this question. Totally understand the desire to see everything built out. For a couple of reasons. One, it's not realistic. So you're not going to see every existing building torn down and every single site fully developed to the maximum. So it's hard, it's not a realistic view. It's also takes an incredible amount of time and money to do those renderings. What we did, I appreciate that the area councils took that on themselves. There were a number of mistakes in those that were not accurate representations of the zoning. The visuals that we did were incredibly time intensive and resource intensive, and it would just be an incredible amount of money to do that for the entire city. So we chose a few perspectives, particularly where we heard concerns that maybe the street was kind of narrow there, Walnut Street in Newtonville, Newton Highlands, and looked at what it would look like, realistic rendering, exact dimensions of existing conditions, and built out per the zoning specifications in a few different views. So we have a couple different scenarios. We have the Walnut Street, we have the Highlands and Lincoln Street, and we've got Washington Street and Newton Corner, which is a little different streetscape. So those are more examples of that could be applied to the different village centers, but we will not be producing a full model of all of the village centers.
Okay, thank you. And also, I might have misheard something that was said earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. Did I hear you say that you are coming close to that financial report, financial analysis? Did I hear that earlier?
So we're doing some additional financial analysis around MRT and,
Okay.
Really trying to better understand the conversion as well as the new construction options. So yeah, we should have that soon. If we don't have that for the next meeting, we'll have it for the first meeting in June.
Right. And that's really we want to better predict which choices the market will make. Will the market choose the 4-unit new construction route, or will the market pick the 6-unit building addition? And because we want to, I think our goal is to level the playing field so that the chances are equal that a developer would consider maintaining an existing building. But we don't want to, again, we want the market to decide, but we don't want it, the path to be only the new build, because we've heard a lot of concern about incentivizing tear downs. But we don't want to make the building conversion so attractive that when a building isn't worth saving because it's not attractive, or because it's got code issues that have a very high cost, that a developer didn't choose the new build. So we're seeking a Goldilocks code there between new build and building conversion.
Good luck to all of us. Thank you. All set, Counselor Lucas.
I told you I'd be brief. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, it's 9:45, and we have folks who still have comments they would like to make. We're not staying here till 11 o'clock. So I'm going to suggest you be summarize, but before we do that, we do have a task. We would like to, I believe, set the public hearing date to open on June 26th.
I move that we set the public hearing to be June 26th.
Thank you. We have a motion on the floor or on the table. All those, any comments on that?
Yeah, why can't we do it earlier?
This is, this is different. This is the public hearing,
Yeah.
and we want to have a committee of the whole for the sake of the council, which we have to have after budget. And so the earliest we could possibly do the committee of the whole might be, as we discussed earlier, June 20th,
June 20.
which is the Tuesday, ahead of the council meeting. And so the following Monday, then we would open the public hearing.
It's just, a few people brought it up, that's the week, a few days before the kids are gone out of
Might be
school.
good to have the kids gone. to come
People,
to a zoning
well,
meeting.
people will be leaving. When I had kids in school, we were out the
I mean,
next
but they
day.
might be going to camp. So,
We need time
we
to
can't
know.
possibly satisfy everyone. We're just opening it.
Okay.
So we'll hear from who is able to come. And I think we really do want to have the full meeting of the full council first. Yeah, so, and we have a lot of folks from, especially from finance, who are almost never, some never able to come to these meetings, even when we've had them on off nights. So there's, how difficult, we've spent all this time on this, and we're gonna have a couple people coming in somewhat cold. Not entirely, we've had materials, but now we have to really pay attention, right? So I think that's the best we can do.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a motion on the table. All those in favor in the committee, please say aye.
Aye.
Counselor Krinsman.
Aye, I was on mute. I said aye. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
My whole family knows I'm an aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Okay, we have finished our task. Now, I know folks have more comments sort of in general, and there's a lot. We've really focused heavily on the MRT in both fields, the renovation and the new. We've talked again some about parking, but there's and a lot about bicycles, but there's stuff in here we haven't touched on. Before we sort of go around the table and say our piece, we certainly can be writing into the planning department, and we have a month between now and the next meeting where we're going to really focus in. Again, we might spend a half an hour at our budget meeting, particularly if we get a summary memo with some of those numbers we're looking for. The other number I'm going to remind is that we talked about numbers with or without parking, or with more or less parking, or with parking some places and not others. But we didn't remind about the, there's what we're doing to satisfy the MBTA communities, and then there's what we're doing for our own sake in our village centers, and we don't have that number either. The number of units that we're enabling by the whole package of zoning. And I understand we have to finish the metrics before we, or that it will change, but just to get and we need to figure out the parking and all that stuff. But to get an order of magnitude, I think it would be, helpful to at least keep that in mind.
And I do want to clarify that what we're doing, what we're able to do is the MBTA communities. calculation, right? And that is assuming every single building gets torn down and they all get maxed out with the most number of units you could fit on that site and 0 parking, if that's the assumption we keep.
Right, that's the, that's the
It's-
decision the market makes.
It's not a build out analysis, so it's not an assessment of what realistically could be built. I know Lexington, which recently adopted their MBTA community zoning and went above and beyond what their requirement was. They did provide a more of an estimate of what they think could get built out in the next like 10 years. Because they have a much smaller number of sites involved and we're able to go site by site, making some assumptions based on what's there now, what they know of that site. We're not providing, we don't have.
Yeah, when we've been asked to do this by other municipalities, to get within a range that's relatively realistic, it requires a couple of steps. First is the identification of likely soft sites. And we've done this for a couple of communities.
Likely.
Likely what are called that have to be redeveloped within the next 20 years. And the way that's typically done is that can be done both visually, vacant lots, sites that are being underutilized, but can also be done by through a GIS analysis about sites that have a lower density on a site than the average. And then what you do is you identify the soft sites, and let's say it's 35% of the total sites that fall under our new zoning by that analysis. You then have to apply another variable, which is the likelihood of what percentage of the soft sites will get redeveloped. So we're already talking about a subset of all the sites we're rezoning, and then a subset of those, which is, and that number is more driven by past market trends and a kind of crystal ball discussion. So what I'm saying is that the number of likely sites to get redeveloped in the next 20 to 30 years in Newton might only be 30% of 30% of the sites are rezoning.
That wasn't the question I was asking.
Okay.
No, I know, I just wanted to be clear when we do provide numbers, and it is a good bit of work to get those numbers beyond what so we focused on getting the number for MBTA community compliance, because that needs to drive some of this work. It's a good bit of extra work to put everything in the model that we don't need to put in. That said, I know there's an interest in that total number, but want to be very clear that that's not a real number.
I understand the dilemma, but we have whole villages like Lower Falls, which don't comply with MBTA communities. They're not part of the package. And well, that might be a bad example because most of those lots are so big, they'd be by special permit anyway. Yeah. So there are other parts of the city, right, that aren't. And that aren't, that have potential for additional development. So, okay, I don't want to belabor it right now, but I think just an order of magnitude, I think is what we're looking for.
I think the risk is that even with the MBTA communities number is that's both the number we already have now, 10,000, let's say as of being 9. It's incredibly unlikely that in the next 20 to 30 years that all of those lots going to turn over because of all the variables we're talking about. But the problem is that within the discourse, there's going to be a demand on all of you that you have to make other policy decisions to anticipate all those people coming that aren't going to come. And so I think that how we frame what that number means and what it means for actual demand on other city services has to be very carefully framed. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. I'm puzzling how to present this to the average person though. And I think that's what we're all concerned about is, how do you articulate in a tangible way that, we're playing a game in MBTA communities we're not really gonna get all this development, but we have to satisfy, but then we're doing,
Yeah.
more across the city because we want to incentivize some of those lots to turn over in a particular way when they do.
You might, let's put it this way, and if Will Cohen was here, he does a very good job of this. I'm sorry, if you only get two at a time. But I think the other answer is that by enabling the zoning, maybe in 50 or 80 years, you will get these number of units, right? Because then you're building a kind of, you're building the possibility for this to happen over the longer term.
Councilor Baker.
So I appreciate that comment. I guess the question I want to mention on context is that we talked about notice to the property owners who are affected, but part of the reason that I think and others are concerned about how this works is when there are developments, there are neighbors and neighborhoods who are also affected by what goes on nearby. So they're not notified directly because they're not the affected parcel that's being given this option, right? You've got the underlying zoning plus you've got the overlay. But the parcel next doors, and you've articulated a little bit about that when you talked about the village zoning, that's saying that if you're next to a residential zone, there's a step down.
Right.
One of the questions
setbacks.
is it mean just a residential zone or residential property? Because there's some, but that's a detail. But I guess the point, and one of the reasons that parking matters to me in this situation, not because I'm just a, concerned about parking.
Just know it.
But it's just the spillover impacts of what happens. That's part of what we're trying to manage. And that's what I'm trying to assess so that if people say, well, wait a minute, you just let all this happen here, and then it's going to spill over into the neighboring property in a way that's not positive for them, but is a positive for the property owners developing, then that's a tension we've been trying to manage in this council for years. And so I think part of our challenge is to say, how are we managing that? Because just to say this only affects this parcel that's being rezoned and giving that opportunity is not the whole picture. And that's why I think we have to really reflect on how we present this and how we do it carefully.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a way, I think the path to incentivizing and encourage engagement is to have people pay attention to the draft maps first relative to where they live and then work backwards. I think I'm thinking as just a stakeholder, a resident of Newton, this would be impenetrable. But if you saw that we were 3 houses away from where we were proposing MRT, by looking at those draft maps, and then you look to see what the MRT is, and then back out of it, I think that you would be able to engage in a way that might make sense, and then maybe contact your local counselor to get advice about what they thought about the code.
But it's not just the people 3 houses away. It's also the people saying, oh, well, our schools, our police, our fire. They have no idea. They think that we're gonna be overrun with, schools will be overflowing again. And so we have to be able to say, no, that's not.
Right.
And you have to give us a coherent way to say that to those people.
Yeah, I think back to my 30% argument, which is just a kind of rough cut on it. Let us talk amongst ourselves about how we, provide some context for what we're talking about in ways that are justifiable.
Although we're a much larger community than Lexington, I think it was very effective for Lexington to present their material in that way.
Right.
You call them soft sites, by, I guess, looking across their community to see, okay, well, what's most likely to be, who's most likely to be interested in this and when and why. So are you set, Councilor Baker? Okay. Councilor Wright?
By the way, I want to just apologize for grumbling at you earlier.
I'd like to talk about this for a little bit, and then I have a few others, which I'll go
One
through really
minute.
quick. So the 10,000 numbers are the 5 villages minus the priority streets plus Route 9. And what's missing are 7 villages in all the priority streets. And that's, I think, will be a big number. Now, you say, oh, this is something that's gonna be built in 30 years, 50 years, whatever. The Washington Street Vision Plan, which we don't have zoning for, called for, I think, 2,500 units, and we have approved, or it's going into the pipeline, over half those numbers, and that's after 3.5 years. So, you're saying, well, it's not gonna get built out for 50 years, but it's a step function. So as soon as you open up the zoning, you're gonna get a lot more. And what we're counting on in the MRT zone are just 4 units. And we're just talking about today, there are lots that are big and they may split in a couple or add additional. So in reality, there might be 10 or 12 units on those lots, which we're not gonna count. But I think we'll be seeing those. And so just doing the bare basics and coming up with that number, I think would be reasonable. And then you can say, oh, by the way, let's do a step function. It is a step function when you open up the zoning, and we expect, 30% in the first 5 or 8 years to start going through the process type of thing. So that's fine on there, but I want to do just a few more things on here.
I do think what's important, and I think that's a really good point. So you want us to come up with a number, basically, you want us to take all village center zone lots.
As if they would count for.
Yes.
And as if they would count for every
Yeah.
community,
Yeah.
and see what the unit capacity is.
Yes.
So what that assumes is that every lot is being flattened.
Yep.
And that
Every
every lot
property
is
for
being,
sales.
every property sells and every lot is being built to the max.
With zero parking.
With
But-
zero parking.
Yeah.
So that's where it is fixed, and that number will be high.
But you
But
can
let's,
actually
but
get more.
we can get that number.
Yeah.
But let's agree,
Yeah.
I'm asking you that that number is completely unrealistic
In the near future.
in 50 to 100
Yeah.
years.
So,
I mean, I think, and I think thinking, so again, what you're saying is that in the near future, every single site will be
Transacted.
will be demolished,
Well-
sold,
Well,
and built to the
no,
maximum.
not
with
everyone.
zero
So
parking.
like the
Right,
review,
so
we're
that's.
talking about
Let's
that you
just
can have
back up.
6 units.
And
and
then
then you
let
can
Zach
have
finish
more.
first.
Okay.
No, because that's what you're asking us to
Yeah.
do, and
Yeah.
you use the word reasonable, but then I'm asking you, that won't happen. It won't happen in the near future, and it wouldn't happen within 50 to 100 years. Do you agree with that?
So yes, I agree that it won't be
Okay, so that there is
totally
a,
down,
correct.
but
There is a subset, so
you-
then there's a subset of that we need to get to, which is some sort of reasonable number.
yes, but
And then
what-
beyond that, what I think Tim is saying, that there's even a subsection of that, possibly even a subsection of that, that over a certain number of years, development will occur. Of course, we want development to occur. Of course, we want to change the zoning and see progress. And we should check ourselves. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that we change the zoning and nothing happens. We definitely don't want that to happen, but I think we need to be very careful about using words like reasonable when we come up with a number, which again, we can provide, and we will.
Yeah.
But it is completely unreasonable,
but
and that's the word you should use.
I don't think it's, again, for the full build out right away, I totally agree, but you're assuming 4 units on the MRT lots. We might have 12, and there'll be lots, on Warren Street, they're gonna have 10, 12, 14 units on there. And yes, but we're not putting it in the numbers.
Under what
and that's
mechanism
fine.
would you get that many units?
Well, a rear lot subdivision, and they're big lots, so they could have multiple units, not multiple buildings.
And there may be some of that. I think it's unlikely, and it certainly doesn't balance out the assumption that every single lot is going to rebuild to the maximum. I think what Zach's trying to say is we just need to be very careful on how we talk about this, because our first goal is doing what we think is best for village centers. That's where we started this 2 years ago, was what is best for the long-term health of village centers and for the city as a whole. We heard a lot tonight about our immediate climate needs. We have serious housing needs. We want vital village centers with businesses and active spaces. That's where we started. That's still our primary goal. Along the way, we had this state requirement come through. We have to meet this number through this arbitrary calculation that may or may not have any relationship to what actually will happen. I want to be careful we're not focused too much on that number, because our goal is what's best for village centers. That number is essentially meaningless. We haven't had our current zoning built out over however many years.
What percentage are we at?
I don't know. offhand.
Total
build out under the current zoning.
There's thousands of units that could be built under the current.
Yep.
zoning.
So we need to be thinking about what's coming because we do need to plan. We are working with the school district. We do need to be thinking about all of these things and what they mean. But we really want to caution away from taking that big number and making that the headline. Because it's not, and it's not a real number. And it's not necessarily what the goal should be here.
So, and I agree that we should increase our housing in the village centers and, you know, who I've been talking to and what I'd like to see, I think, and we'll start a little bit on this is, you know, the village centers being VC2 and in select places VC3, because VC3 gets pretty high, which it goes up to, you know, 6.5 stories type of thing, but or 4.5. But I'm just gonna go through these other ones really quick.
Right.
Yeah, can I go through this? real quick?
Yep, I understand.
I wanted to make a suggestion.
Please.
When we did the Washington Village plan, I thought it was a nutty idea, but James said, let's go through it as a group, page by page. And it's a pain in the, it is a pain in the neck, but you cover everything that way.
And we're gonna be doing that this summer. I mean, we'll have we're gonna do some more in an orderly way in our first June meeting. And we're not gonna do one person with a half an hour and like that. We're gonna go topic by topic. I also understand for everyone's information that the planning department is creating information sheets on the different topics. So that's going to be helpful to us too. I don't know when we're getting them. I think I asked you a week ago and it was going to be several weeks.
Yeah, hopefully the next couple weeks.
Okay, so, but that will be helpful to us, I think, in terms of organizing our own heads around this and then helping us to walk through the different topic areas and the ordinance itself. You know, we just got this on Friday and it's great to have it in front of us, but, you know, reading zoning isn't something that, you know, takes a while to imagine, but you know, then to assimilate it, it takes some time and we're gonna benefit from these additional studies you're gonna do. I'm guessing now from what you're saying, it's gonna be over the summer, you're gonna get illustrations into the text. We've seen illustrations over time, but they're not with us right now, so there's gonna be
We'll figure out exactly what we
Yeah.
need once.
Right. I mean, each of us can go through the text and make notations or submit a bulleted list of comments or questions. I don't think we should go much longer tonight.
I just have two big issues I just want to cover.
Can you summarize them?
Yes. So the setbacks in VC2 and VC3, presently our setbacks are half the building height or 15 feet, whichever is higher. And what is being proposed, it's 15 feet. And if you're within 50 feet of residential, you can be 3.5 stories, which is 56 feet or 62. And
excuse me, but like a summary would be.
So I
think the metrics are off on the.
they're too large.
And you can then submit a.
And what's in like MU4 is a good way for, I think, setbacks and against residential buildings. I don't care about VC2 and VC3. And then there's some concerns, there's a lot of concerns on some of the adaptive reuse in VC2 and VC3, which I can forward. I don't know if it was just a mistake that some of it's in. And then the other one, BC1, which is on Route 9, which is mixed use. I'm worried that you're going to have all these mixed use buildings with all these driveways on Route 9. And so I don't know if maybe the use would be only allow, you know, low volume uses there instead of high volume. I just think it's just an awful situation, all those driveways.
Yeah, we can look closely at the uses allowed in BC one and think about what's appropriate. Along with that.
My concern on that very same point, is we don't want to drive people away from our village standards.
Yeah.
Well, this curb cut limitation is good, I think.
The state highway.
Yeah,
They can't add new curb.
Yeah.
So folks, can everybody come at 6:30 to our budget meeting so that we can take on some other, we're gonna get an update on the 10 communities waiver and set the public hearing for that. And maybe we'll have a discussion about zoning. And then I think, Counselor Wright, can you submit your list of comments or your markup text?
I have lots of markup.
Yeah.
30, the next regular meeting.
Our consultant needs to leave, and you may go ahead and leave.
Okay.
And no, and Council Baker wants to.
They charge us extra after.
We're just gonna stay for this one.
Council Baker has a motion he would like to make. You don't have to stay for the motion.
Move hold before Mr. Fluff turns into a.
On both items. Council Baker, we hold on both items. Oh, Councilor Krinsman.
No.
So. We have a motion to hold both items. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any, I know, any opposition or abstentions? No, thank you very much. And we're going to see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, counselors.
Get my name on the ballot.
I'm
When I shouted at you.
You're gonna say.
First time I brought it.